Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Alejandro, and I've been hauling freight across the American highways for most of my adult life. There's something about the endless asphalt stretching ahead, the hum of 18 wheels on pavement, and the solitude of the open road that's always spoken to me. I've driven through every state, seen sunrises over the Rockies and sunsets over the Great Plains. But there's one night that changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. It was a cold February evening in 2018 when my phone rang at exactly 10:15 p.m. I was somewhere between Denver and Kansas City, hauling a load of electronics to a distribution center in Missouri. The caller ID showed my wife Laura's name, which immediately sent a chill down my spine. Laura knew better than anyone not to call me during a run unless it was an absolute emergency. We'd been married for 15 years, and she understood the dangers of distracting a driver on these dark highways. Her voice came through the speaker with an urgency I'd never heard before. It was definitely Laura, but there was something off about her tone, strained, almost desperate. She kept repeating that I needed to come home immediately, that something terrible had happened, and she needed me there right away. When I pressed her for details, she just kept saying, "Please, just come home. I can't explain over the phone. Just please come home now." The desperation in her voice made my blood run cold. In all our years together, Laura had never sounded like that. She was always the strong one, the one who kept everything together while I was on the road for weeks at a time. Hearing her so broken, so frightened, made me forget everything else. I immediately pulled over at the next truck stop, called my dispatcher to report a family emergency, and started the long drive back to our home in Tucson. The drive felt endless. Every mile marker seemed to mock me as I pushed the rig harder than I should have, my mind racing with possibilities. Had something happened to her sister, her parents? Was she hurt? The scenarios playing in my head got darker with each passing hour. I tried calling her back multiple times, but the phone just rang and rang with no answer. That silence was almost worse than the original call. I finally pulled into our driveway at 3:47 a.m., the headlights of my Peterbilt illuminating our small desert home. But something was immediately wrong. The front door was hanging open, swaying slightly in the desert wind. All the lights were off except for one dim lamp in the living room that cast eerie shadows through the windows. Laura's car was in the driveway, but the whole scene felt abandoned, like a movie set after the crew had gone home. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The front door creaked as I pushed it fully open. "Laura," I called out, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the darkness inside. I stepped into our living room and immediately knew we'd been robbed. The couch was overturned, our coffee table was smashed, and there were papers and broken picture frames scattered across the floor. The TV was gone, along with Laura's jewelry box from the mantel. But where was Laura? I searched every room in the house, calling her name, my heart hammering against my ribs. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter with her wallet and keys inside. Her cell phone was on the bedroom nightstand, the screen cracked like it had been thrown. In the bedroom, the dresser drawers were pulled out and dumped, clothes scattered everywhere. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent and thorough. That's when my phone rang again. Unknown number. Hello, I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Officer Martinez with the Tucson Police Department. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your wife Laura was involved in a fatal car accident this afternoon on Interstate 10. She was pronounced dead at the scene at approximately 2:30 p.m. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered backward, catching myself against the wall. That's impossible, I managed to say. She called me at 10:15 tonight. I have the call log right here on my phone. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, I understand this is difficult, but Mrs. Rodriguez has been deceased for over 12 hours. The accident occurred when she lost control of her vehicle during a dust storm. I'm going to need you to come down to the coroner's office to make a positive identification. I looked at my phone's call history with shaking hands. There it was, Laura's number, incoming call at 10:15 p.m., duration 4 minutes and 37 seconds. But according to the police, she'd been dead for over 8 hours when that call was made. The identification at the coroner's office was the worst experience of my life. There was no doubt it was Laura lying on that cold metal table. The officer explained that she'd been traveling to visit her sister in Phoenix when the accident occurred. She'd lost control in a dust storm and rolled her car multiple times. She died instantly, they assured me, though I'm not sure if that was meant to be a comfort. I returned home to find the house exactly as I'd left it, destroyed and empty. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the phone call, that grief and shock had caused some kind of hallucination. But the call log on my phone was undeniable proof. I even contacted the phone company, and they confirmed the call had been made from Laura's number at exactly the time I remembered. That's when the other strange things started happening. I'd be sitting in the living room and hear Laura's footsteps upstairs. I'd find the coffee maker turned on in the morning, even though I'd unplugged it the night before. Her favorite coffee mug would appear on the kitchen counter, still warm to the touch. At night, I'd hear her voice calling my name from somewhere in the house. But when I'd search, I'd find nothing. The worst incident happened about a week after the funeral. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to force myself to sleep when the house phone started ringing. Not a normal ring, just the dial tone, loud and persistent. I went to the living room and found the phone off the hook. When I hung it up, it immediately started ringing again. This time I answered. Static filled the line, but underneath the white noise, I could hear Laura's voice. She was calling my name over and over, getting more desperate each time. Alejandro, Alejandro, help me. I can't find my way. I slammed the phone down and unplugged it from the wall. The next morning, I knew I needed help. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped between grief and whatever supernatural nightmare my life had become. A friend of mine, Carlos, who worked at the same trucking company, told me about a woman named Elena who lived on the outskirts of town. She was known in the Hispanic community as someone who could help with spiritual problems, someone who understood things, that the church and modern medicine couldn't explain. Alina lived in a small adobe house surrounded by desert and sagebrush. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. When I told her my story, she listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as if she'd heard similar tales before. "Your wife," she said finally, "she is not the one calling you." I started to protest, but she held up her hand. Something dark has taken her voice, her identity. In our tradition, we call them imitators, spirits that feed on grief and use the voices of the dead to torment the living. Your first call, when she asked you to come home, that may have been her true spirit reaching out in her final moments. But everything after, that was something else. Alina explained that someone had put a curse on Laura, a working of dark magic that had caused her accident and now prevented her soul from finding peace. She said the entity that was mimicking Laura was growing stronger each time I responded to it, feeding off my grief and desperation. "We need to cut the connection," Alina said, "and we need to free your wife's spirit so she can move on." The ritual took place that night. Alina burned sage and copal, drew symbols in salt around my house, and chanted in a mixture of Spanish and what I think was Nahuatl. She gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and stones, told me to keep it with me always. When she was finished, she looked exhausted but relieved. "It is done," she said. "The imitator can no longer use her voice. Your wife's spirit is free now, but Alejandro, you must be careful. Someone did this to her, someone who wished her harm. They may try again." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she was already packing up her things, eager to leave. That night, for the first time since Laura's death, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no mysterious phone calls, no coffee mugs appearing on counters. Just silence. A year passed before I learned the truth about who had killed my wife. I was coming out of a bank downtown when I ran into Maria, one of Laura's former coworkers from the insurance office where she'd worked. We'd met at the funeral, but this was the first time I'd seen her since then. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap and avoiding eye contact. "Alejandro," she said finally, "there's something I need to tell you about Laura. Something I should have told you a long time ago." We sat on a bench outside the bank, while Maria told me a story that made my blood boil. There had been another woman at Laura's office, a woman named Carmen who had hated Laura from the moment she started working there. Carmen saw Laura as competition. Laura was better at her job, more popular with clients, and had been promoted twice, while Carmen remained stuck in the same position. Carmen was always spreading rumors about Laura, Maria said, making up stories, trying to sabotage her work, but it got worse than that. Another coworker, Rosa, told me that Carmen had gone to a bruja, a witch in Nogales. She paid her to do something to Laura, to remove her from the path, as she put it. According to Maria, Carmen had bragged about it to Rosa after Laura's death, claiming credit for the accident. She told Rosa that the witch had promised Laura would die within a month, and when the car crash happened, Carmen celebrated like she'd won the lottery. "I didn't tell you before because I was scared," Maria admitted. "Carmen has connections to some dangerous people, and I have children to think about. But I couldn't live with the guilt anymore." I thanked Maria for her honesty and told her I understood her fear. As for Carmen, I never got the chance to confront her. 3 months after my conversation with Maria, I heard through the grapevine that Carmen had died of cancer. The disease had come on suddenly and aggressively, taking her in less than 6 weeks. I won't lie and say I felt sorry for her. Sometimes I think about that last phone call from Laura, the real one. Elena believed it was Laura's spirit, trapped and in pain, reaching out for help in her final moments. She died alone on that desert highway, scared and calling for me. And somehow her love had been strong enough to bridge the gap between life and death for just a few minutes. I still drive trucks, still traverse the same highways where Laura took her last breath. But now I carry Elena's pouch in my pocket, and I say a prayer for Laura's soul every time I pass the spot where she died. The house is quiet now, peaceful. Laura has found her rest. But I've learned to be more careful about the people I trust, more aware of the darkness that some humans carry in their hearts. Because sometimes the real monsters aren't supernatural at all. They're the people who smile to your face while plotting your destruction. The ones who turn to dark magic when their jealousy becomes too much to bear. The desert roads are lonely, but they've taught me that the living can be far more dangerous than the dead. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Roberto, and I've been driving long-haul trucks for over 17 years. I've seen my share of strange things on America's highways. Everything from unexplained lights in the sky to animals that shouldn't exist. But nothing prepared me for what happened on a storm-soaked night in eastern Oregon, somewhere between Pendleton and Baker City. It was late March of 2019, and I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill outside Portland to a construction site in Colorado. The weather had been decent when I left the Pacific Northwest, but as I climbed into the Blue Mountains, a storm system moved in faster than the meteorologists had predicted. What started as light rain quickly became a torrential downpour that hammered my windshield like machine gun fire. By the time I reached the high country, the storm had turned into something biblical. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged purple veins, and the wind rocked my fully loaded rig like it was a toy. The radio was nothing but static and emergency weather warnings. I could barely see the white lines on the asphalt, even with my headlights on full beam. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Instead of pushing through on Interstate 84 like I'd planned, I took a state highway that cut through the mountains. It was a longer route, but it would get me away from the worst of the storm, and the mountain passes where trucks had been known to slide off into the void during weather like this. The state highway was narrow and winding, carved into the mountainside with steep drops on one side and rock walls on the other. Every curve was a gamble, every mile a white-knuckle exercise in faith and physics. The rain was coming down so hard that my wipers couldn't keep up, and I had to slow to a crawl just to stay on the road. It was just past midnight when my headlights illuminated a road sign that made my heart sink. Next services, 67 miles. I was running low on fuel. My logbook said I needed to rest soon, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The smart thing would be to find somewhere to hole up until morning. But in this godforsaken stretch of mountain highway, there wasn't supposed to be anywhere to stop. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was just another trucker who'd pulled over to wait out the storm. But as I got closer, I could see it was actually a rest area. A proper truck stop with diesel pumps, a small building, and parking for maybe a dozen rigs. The neon sign was old and flickering, casting an eerie blue glow through the rain. Mountain View, Rest Stop, Fuel Food Lodging. I'd driven this route before, years ago, and I didn't remember any truck stop here. But storms can play tricks on your memory, and I was too tired and too low on fuel to question good fortune. I pulled into the lot and parked next to 3 other big rigs that were already there. That's when I noticed something odd. The other trucks looked wrong. They were older models, some from decades past, and they were in terrible condition. Rust covered their trailers like cancer, and weeds grew up through cracks in their chassis. One had its windshield completely spiderwebbed with cracks, and another was missing its passenger door entirely. I sat in my cab for a few minutes, engine idling, studying the scene. The building looked like something from the 1960s, all angular lines, and that atomic age architecture that was popular back then. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, and I could see figures moving around inside. Other drivers, I assumed, waiting out the storm just like me. The smart thing would have been to stay in my truck until morning. But I needed fuel, and I needed to use the restroom, and the building looked welcoming enough. I grabbed my rain jacket and logbook and made a dash for the entrance. The inside of the building was like stepping back in time. Everything was vintage, the chrome and vinyl furniture, the black and white checkered floor, even the jukebox in the corner playing some Patsy Cline song I half remembered from my childhood. The air smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and unpleasant. There were maybe 6 or 7 other drivers scattered around the room, sitting at tables or standing by the windows looking out at the storm. They were all men, all wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of date. Work shirts and jeans and trucker caps from companies I'd never heard of. They looked tired the way long-haul drivers always look, but there was something else in their faces, something hollow and distant. I nodded to a few of them as I walked to the counter, but none of them nodded back. They just stared at me with these empty expressions, like they were looking through me rather than at me. The man behind the counter was elderly, probably in his 70s, with thin white hair and thick glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. "Terrible night," I said, trying to make conversation. He just stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yes," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Terrible nights happen here often." I paid for my fuel and asked about food, but he just pointed to a vending machine in the corner that looked like it hadn't been restocked since the Carter administration. The coffee was black as motor oil and twice as bitter, but it was hot, and I needed the caffeine. I took a table near the window and tried to call my dispatcher, but my phone showed no signal. That's when I started paying closer attention to the other drivers. They weren't talking to each other, which was unusual. Truckers are generally a social bunch, especially when we're stuck somewhere waiting out bad weather. We swap stories, complain about dispatchers, share information about road conditions. But these men just sat in silence, staring into their coffee cups or out at the rain. And they weren't drinking their coffee. I watched for 10 minutes, and not one of them took a sip. They just held their mugs like they were warming their hands, even though it wasn't particularly cold inside the building. Then I noticed their clothes were wet, not just damp from running through the rain, but soaked through like they'd been underwater. Water dripped from their hair onto the table, but it didn't form puddles. The water just seemed to disappear as soon as it hit the surface. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I told myself I was just tired and spooked by the storm. I finished my coffee and headed for the restroom, which was down a narrow hallway lined with vintage trucking memorabilia, old signs, photographs of highways being built, pictures of trucks from the 50s and 60s. The restroom was clean but old-fashioned, with a mirror that was silvered and spotted with age. As I was washing my hands, I heard voices coming from the main room. Not conversation, but something else. Moaning. Low, anguished sounds like men in terrible pain. I dried my hands quickly and walked back down the hallway, but the sound stopped as soon as I emerged into the main room. All the drivers were sitting exactly as I'd left them, silent and still. But now, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Their reflections in the windows were wrong. I could see them sitting at their tables, but their reflections showed them standing, arms reaching out like they were trying to grab something. And their faces in the glass were contorted with terror and pain. I backed toward the door, trying to keep my movements casual, but the old man behind the counter was watching me with those magnified eyes. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. "The storm's not over." "I need to check on my rig," I said, which was true enough. He smiled, and his teeth were yellow and too numerous, like he had extra rows of them. "Your rig's fine. Why don't you stay, have another coffee, rest a while?" That's when one of the other drivers finally spoke. "Don't," he said without looking up from his mug. "Don't stay. Get out while you can." The old man's face twisted with anger. "Thomas," he said sharply, "you know better than that." The driver named Thomas finally looked up, and I saw that his face was crushed on one side, like he'd been in a terrible accident. "How long?" he asked me. "How long since?" "Since what?" I whispered. "Since 1973, said another driver, this one with burns covering half his face. For me, it was 73, jackknifed in the ice, went right over the edge. Now they were all looking at me, and I could see their injuries clearly. One had his throat cut open. Another was missing part of his skull. They were all dead, had been dead for years, maybe decades, and somehow I'd stumbled into whatever purgatory they were trapped in. "The storm," the burned man continued. "It brings us back, makes us live it over and over. The crash, the fire, the falling." The old man behind the counter was no longer smiling. His face had changed, become something predatory and hungry. "Don't listen to them," he said. "They're confused. Stay and rest. Stay forever." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted for the door and ran through the rain to my truck, fumbling with the keys as the building behind me erupted in sounds. Screaming, the crash of metal on metal, the roar of engines, and the squeal of brakes. In my mirrors, I could see the other trucks moving, racing around the parking lot in endless loops, crashing into each other and bursting into flames before starting the cycle again. I got my engine started and peeled out of that parking lot like the devil himself was chasing me. Maybe he was. I drove through the rain for another hour before I found a legitimate truck stop, one I recognized from previous trips. I pulled in and sat in the cab, shaking, until the sun came up. The next morning, I called my dispatcher and asked him to check something for me. I gave him the approximate location of the rest stop I'd visited. He called me back an hour later. "Roberto," he said, "there's no truck stop on that highway. Hasn't been one there for 40 years. There used to be one called Mountain View, but it closed in 1978 after a series of accidents. Multiple fatalities. They said the place was cursed. I've driven that route several times since then, always during daylight hours. I've never seen any sign of the Mountain View rest stop. But sometimes, when storms move through the mountains, and the rain comes down hard enough to blur the line between the living world and whatever lies beyond, I swear I can see distant lights flickering in my mirrors. And I always drive a little faster until they're gone." My name is Hugo, and I've been driving 18-wheelers across the American Southwest for over 22 years. The desert highways between Phoenix and El Paso have been my regular route for most of that time, and I thought I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every curve in the road. But a few months ago, I picked up something that changed everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when I stopped at a rest area outside Tucson, one of those forgotten places that dot the desert highways like scattered bones. This particular stop was old and rundown, the kind of place where the vending machines haven't worked since the Clinton administration, and the restrooms smell like they haven't been cleaned since then either. But it served its purpose, a place to stretch your legs, check your load, and maybe catch a few minutes of peace before heading back into the night. I was walking around my rig, doing my routine inspection, when something caught my eye near an old concrete picnic table that was cracked and weathered by decades of desert sun. It was a radio, sitting there like someone had just set it down and walked away. Not a modern radio, but one of those vintage models from the 1950s, rounded edges, chrome details, and those big analog dials that you had to turn by hand. Now, I've been around long enough to know that good things don't just appear in truck stop parking lots for no reason. But the radio looked to be in decent condition, and I figured whoever left it, there wasn't coming back for it. My own radio had been acting up lately, cutting out at random times and leaving me with nothing but static for company during those long desert nights. So I picked it up, carried it back to my cab, and set it on the dashboard. The radio was heavier than it looked, built like they used to build things back when quality mattered more than profit margins. The chrome was tarnished but intact, and when I turned it over, I found a small brass plate that read Philco Model 47 made in USA. No date, but from the style, I guessed it was probably from the late 40s or early 50s. That night, as I was pulling out of Tucson with a load of electronics bound for Dallas, I decided to see if the old radio still worked. I plugged it into my cigarette lighter adapter and turned the dial. At first, there was nothing but static and the occasional snippet of some distant station fading in and out. But as I drove deeper into the desert, something strange happened. The static began to clear, and I heard music. Not modern music, but the kind of songs they played on the radio when my grandfather was young. Big band music, crooners with smooth voices singing about lost love and distant shores. It was actually pleasant, nostalgic in a way that made me think of old movies and simpler times. I was enjoying the music and the steady rhythm of the road when suddenly the songs cut out. The radio fell silent for a moment. Then I heard something that made me nearly swerve into the median. It was a woman's voice, panicked and desperate. "Please," she was saying, "if anyone can hear this, I need help. There's been an accident at mile marker 112 on Highway 10. My car went off the road and I can't get out. Please, somebody help me." I grabbed my CB radio and tried to relay the message, but got no response. I checked my position. I was still about 15 miles from mile marker 112. I pushed my rig as hard as I dared, racing through the desert night with my emergency flashers going, expecting to find a crash scene, ambulances, maybe a helicopter. But when I reached mile marker 112, there was nothing. No accident, no cars, no emergency vehicles. Just empty desert stretching out under the star-filled sky. I pulled over and walked the area with my flashlight, looking for skid marks, broken glass, anything that might indicate where a car had left the road. Nothing. I tried to convince myself that I'd misheard the location, that maybe the accident was further ahead. I drove for another 50 miles, scanning both sides of the highway, but I never found any sign of a crash. And as soon as I passed mile marker 112, the woman's voice had stopped. The radio went back to playing that old-fashioned music, like nothing had happened. For the next 2 days, I tried to forget about it. Maybe I'd picked up some kind of emergency transmission from a different highway. Or maybe it was just some kind of radio play that I'd mistaken for a real emergency. These things happen on the road. Your mind plays tricks on you when you've been driving too long. But when I started my next run, heading back west with a load of furniture, the radio did it again. This time it was a man's voice, calm but filled with infinite sadness. "If anyone's listening," he said, "please tell my wife Margaret and my daughter Carol that I love them. I'm lost somewhere dark and empty, and I don't think I'm ever coming home. Tell them I tried to make it back. Tell them I'm sorry." I was passing mile marker 87 when his voice came through, and I happened to glance to my right. There, maybe 50 yards off the highway, was a white wooden cross. Even in the darkness, I could see it clearly in my headlights, a memorial to someone who had died on this stretch of road. A cold understanding began to creep over me. I pulled over and walked to the cross. It was old, weathered by years of desert wind and sun, but the inscription was still readable. Michael Thomas Patterson, beloved husband and father, 1953 to 1978. I stood there in the desert silence, staring at that cross as the pieces fell into place. The vintage radio, the old music, the voices calling out from the darkness. Somehow, I was hearing the last words of people who had died on this highway. People who had been trying to call for help in their final moments. Their voices trapped somehow in the radio waves, playing back their desperate pleas decades after their deaths. I should have thrown the radio away right then. Any sane person would have, but something compelled me to keep it, to see what else it might reveal. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a sense of responsibility to these voices from the past. Whatever it was, I carried that radio with me for 3 more runs. The third incident nearly broke me. I was driving through the night, somewhere between Phoenix and Flagstaff, when the music stopped again. This time, I heard a child crying. Not speaking, just sobbing with the kind of heartbreak that only children can express. The sound was so pure, so filled with fear and confusion, that I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too badly to keep driving. The crying went on for maybe 5 minutes, getting softer and more distant until it finally faded away. When I looked up, I saw another cross by the roadside, this one smaller than the others, decorated with faded plastic flowers and a small teddy bear. That's when I knew I couldn't keep the radio anymore. Whatever force was at work, whatever supernatural mechanism was allowing these voices to reach across the years, it was more than I could handle. The weight of all that grief, all that unfinished business, was crushing me. But the radio wasn't done with me yet. On my last night with it, I was hauling a load of steel beams toward Albuquerque when the device suddenly turned itself on. I hadn't touched it. It had been sitting silent on my dashboard for hours. But now it crackled to life with a volume I'd never heard before, filling the cab with static so loud I couldn't hear myself think. Through the static came voices, not one or two, but dozens of them. Men, women, children, all talking at once, their words overlapping and blending into a chorus of desperation. They were calling out names, pleading for help, trying to send final messages to loved ones they would never see again. The sound was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a crowd where everyone was screaming. I tried to turn the radio off, but the knobs wouldn't respond. I tried to unplug it, but the cord seemed to be fused to the adapter. The voices grew louder and more desperate, and I could feel my sanity starting to slip. I was going 70 miles per hour down a dark highway with no other traffic in sight, and I was losing control. Finally, in desperation, I grabbed the radio and hurled it out the passenger window. I watched it tumble through the darkness in my side mirror, sparks flying when it hit the asphalt, and then it was gone. Immediately, the voices stopped, and blessed silence filled my cab. I drove to the next truck stop and sat in the parking lot until sunrise, trying to process what I'd experienced. When the sun came up, I drove back to look for the radio, thinking maybe I should take it to a museum or a university, somewhere that might be able to study it. But I never found it. The desert had swallowed it up like it had never existed. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm driving those same highways, I think about that radio and the voices it contained. I wonder if someone else has found it by now, if they're hearing those same desperate pleas from the past. I wonder about all the people who have died on America's highways over the decades, and whether their last words are still floating out there in the electromagnetic spectrum, waiting for the right receiver to pick them up. I've learned my lesson about picking up things that other people have thrown away. Sometimes there's a good reason why they got rid of them. Sometimes the past is better left buried in the desert, along with all its secrets and sorrows. But I still drive those highways, and I still remember their voices. And sometimes, late at night, when the static clears and the airwaves are quiet, I say a prayer for all the souls who never made it home. My name is Daniel, and I've been driving long-haul trucks across the American heartland for the better part of 15 years. I've seen everything from tornadoes touching down in Kansas wheat fields to northern lights dancing over the Canadian border. But there's one night that stands out from all the rest, a night that challenged everything I thought I knew about the line between the living and the dead. It was late October of 2017, and I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Nebraska to a dealer outside Little Rock. The weather had been perfect all day, clear skies, light traffic, and that crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive. But as the sun went down and I crossed into Arkansas, a fog began to roll in from the river valleys, thick and gray and heavy with moisture. By the time I reached the back roads of southeastern Arkansas, the fog was so dense I could barely see 20 feet ahead of my headlights. I'd driven these rural highways before, but never in conditions like this. The white center line disappeared into the mist like a ghost, and the trees on either side of the road loomed up out of the darkness like the walls of some vast cathedral. It was just past 11 p.m. when I saw her. At first, she was just a pale shape at the edge of my vision, standing on the shoulder of the road like she was waiting for something. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone's car had broken down and they needed help. That's the trucker code. You help people when you can, because someday you might be the one who needs helping. As I got closer, I could see it was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the fog. Her dark hair hung long and straight around her shoulders, and she was standing perfectly still, not waving for help or showing any signs of distress. She just stood there, watching my truck approach with eyes that reflected my headlights like a deer's. I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. "You okay, miss?" I called out. "Need a ride somewhere?" She didn't answer right away, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something timeless about her face, something that reminded me of old photographs from my grandmother's album. Finally, she nodded and walked toward my truck with slow, measured steps. When she climbed into the cab, I noticed several things that should have set off alarm bells in my head. First, she was bone dry despite the heavy fog, and the fact that she'd been standing outside for who knows how long. Second, she was wearing what looked like a wedding dress, old-fashioned, with long sleeves and a high collar, the kind of thing you might see in a museum. And third, the temperature in my cab dropped at least 20 degrees the moment she sat down. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation while I pulled back onto the highway. "Home," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to get home." "Where's home?" Pointed ahead into the fog. "Not far. I'll know it when I see it." We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rumble of my diesel engine and the whisper of fog against the windshield. I kept glancing over at my passenger, and each time I looked, she seemed more translucent, like she was fading away. But whenever I blinked and looked again, she appeared solid and real. She was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder and out the back window, like she was afraid something was following us. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and I could see that she was trembling, though whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. "You seem worried about something," I said. "Someone giving you trouble?" She turned those dark eyes on me, and for a moment I felt like I was looking into a deep well. "There was an accident," she said. "Up ahead near the old bridge. That's where it happened." "What kind of accident?" "A wedding party. The car went off the road into the creek. The water was so cold, so dark. I couldn't get out. I tried, but the doors wouldn't open and the water kept rising." Her voice trailed off and she turned back to the window. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I told myself she was probably in shock from whatever trauma she'd experienced. People who have been in accidents sometimes talk like that, mixing past and present, real and imagined. The fog began to thin as we drove deeper into the countryside, and I could make out the dark shapes of farmhouses and barns scattered across the rolling hills. Most of them were dark, their occupants long asleep, but a few had porch lights burning like lonely beacons in the night. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a narrow dirt road that branched off to the right. "Turn there." I followed her directions down a winding lane that led through stands of ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The road was rough and potholed, clearly not maintained by the county, and I had to drive slowly to keep from losing a tire. After about a mile, we came to an old farmhouse that sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown gardens and sagging fence posts. The house was dark, except for a single light burning in what looked like the front parlor. It was a Victorian-era place, with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. The kind of house that had probably been beautiful once, but now looked tired and forgotten. "This is it," she said. "This is home." I turned to say something to her, maybe to ask if she needed me to wait and make sure she got inside safely. But the passenger seat was empty. She was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. The only sign that she had ever existed was a lingering scent of jasmine, and the fact that the cab was still cold as a tomb. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty seat and trying to process what had just happened. And I climbed down from my truck and walked up the overgrown path to the farmhouse. The boards of the front porch creaked under my weight, and I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears as I knocked on the door. After what seemed like forever, the door opened to reveal an elderly black woman wearing a faded housecoat and slippers. She looked to be in her 80s, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of many sorrows. When she saw me standing there, her expression changed from curiosity to something like recognition. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said before I could speak. "You picked her up on the highway." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "My granddaughter, Sarah," the old woman said, stepping aside to let me in. "She died 37 years ago, on her wedding night. Car went off the Cypress Creek Bridge during a storm. They found the car in the morning, but it took 3 days to find her body." She led me into the parlor, where the walls were covered with old photographs. Most of them were sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced people in Victorian clothing, but one frame held a wedding photo from what looked like the 1980s. The bride in the picture was the woman who had ridden in my truck. "She's been trying to come home ever since," the old woman continued. "Shows up every few years, usually during the foggy season. Always finds someone to give her a ride, but she never quite makes it all the way. Something about the way she died, the trauma of it, keeps her wandering." I stayed for maybe an hour, listening to stories about Sarah and her short life, her plans for the future that had been cut short by a patch of wet leaves and a moment of bad luck. The old woman, her grandmother, whose name was Ruth, had been keeping vigil all these years, hoping that someday Sarah would find her way home for good. When I finally left that house and got back on the highway, I found myself thinking about all the things we take for granted, the assumption that we'll wake up tomorrow, that the people we love will be there when we need them, that our own stories will have proper endings. Sarah had been robbed of all of that, left to wander the foggy roads of southeastern Arkansas, eternally trying to return to a home that existed only in memory. I've driven that route many times since then, especially during the autumn months when the fog rolls in thick from the river. Sometimes I think I see her standing by the roadside, that pale figure in white waiting for someone to stop. But I've never stopped again. Not because I'm afraid of her. There was nothing malevolent about Sarah, only sadness and confusion. I don't stop because I know now that giving her a ride only prolongs her suffering, keeps her trapped in that endless loop of trying to reach a destination she can never truly arrive at. But I do say a prayer for her whenever I pass that stretch of highway. I pray that someday she'll find the peace that has eluded her for nearly 4 decades, that she'll finally be able to let go of her earthly attachments and move on to whatever comes next. Because if 30 years on the road has taught me anything, it's that we're all just travelers passing through. And the only thing that really matters is how we treat each other along the way. Sarah taught me that love can transcend death, that the bonds we form in life can be stronger than the grave itself. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog is thick and the world feels thin, I think that's the most beautiful and terrible truth of all. My name is Braulio, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2015, when I was running freight between San Antonio and the Mexican border. I was 34 years old then, living with my father in a small house on the west side of town. My 12-year-old son lived with his mother in Corpus Christi, and I'd visit him whenever I could manage the time off from driving. Those were good days for the most part. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and I had a routine that kept me sane. Friday and Saturday nights, my old man and I would hit the local cantinas, drink beer, and solve the world's problems until they kicked us out. Sundays were for recovery and getting ready for another week on the road. But there had been talk around the truck yard about extortion rings operating along our usual routes. Narcos shaking down drivers, demanding tribute money, threatening families if you didn't pay up. It hadn't happened to me yet, but I knew guys who'd been approached, guys who now carried extra cash just to buy safe passage through certain stretches of highway. The company I worked for ran older equipment, and my truck in particular had a habit of breaking down at the worst possible times. Nothing dangerous, just irritating mechanical failures that would strand me for hours while I waited for a mechanic. The dispatchers knew about it, so they usually gave me easier runs and built extra time into my schedules. It was a Friday night in late July when my luck ran out. I'd been drinking at a dive bar called El Corazon with my father. Nothing too heavy, just enough to take the edge off another week of highway hypnosis and truck stop coffee. The place was dimly lit and loud, filled with working men trying to forget their troubles for a few hours. My old man was well on his way to passing out at our table when a stranger approached. The man was maybe 40, wearing an expensive leather jacket despite the Texas heat. He had the kind of calm confidence that comes from never having to worry about consequences. He sat down without being invited and started talking like he'd known me for years. He knew everything about me, where I worked, what routes I usually drove, what time I typically made my deliveries, even where my son went to school in Corpus. He laid it all out casually, like he was reading from a file, while my father snored softly into his beer. I should have walked away right then, should have grabbed my old man and gotten the hell out of there. But the alcohol had made me bold and stupid, and I started to stand up, ready to knock this guy's teeth down his throat. That's when the bartender caught my eye and shook his head frantically. Later, he told me the stranger had connections to some very dangerous people, the kind who made problems disappear permanently. So I sat back down and listened as he confirmed details about my life that no stranger should have known. He wasn't threatening me, not yet. He was just letting me know that they'd been watching, that I was already caught in their web whether I knew it or not. The weekend passed like a fever dream. I kept waiting for something to happen, for the other shoe to drop, but Monday morning came and went normally. I showed up at the yard, loaded my trailer with auto parts bound for Laredo, and headed south on Highway 35. It was supposed to be a routine overnight run, Leave San Antonio in the evening, drive through the night, make the delivery Tuesday morning, and be back home by afternoon. But as the sun went down and I crossed into the mesquite and cactus country south of the city, I started feeling strange, drowsy and disoriented, even though I'd had plenty of sleep and hadn't been drinking. That's when I saw the roadblock. 4 black SUVs arranged across both lanes of the highway, their headlights creating a wall of glare in the darkness. I had no choice but to stop. There was nowhere to run, even if my truck had been capable of outrunning their vehicles. 5 men got out of the SUVs, all of them armed, all of them moving with the casual efficiency of people who did this sort of thing for a living. 4 of them spread out around my truck, while the 5th, a big man with a gray beard, walked up to my driver's side window. "You made us wait," he said, like we had an appointment I'd forgotten about. He tossed a duffel bag onto the ground at the base of my cab. "Open it." The bag was full of cash, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Thousands of dollars in neat bundles, enough to pay off every debt I had, and then some. "Simple job," the bearded man continued. "You pick up a package, drive it for exactly 1 hour, then dump it wherever you want. The money's yours when it's done." That's when I saw what they wanted me to haul. 2 of his men were dragging something from the back of one of the SUVs, something wrapped in white sheets and bound with rope. Even in the darkness, even wrapped up like that, it was obviously a body. A human being who was now very much dead. I tried to bargain with them, told them I couldn't do it, that I'd never say anything about what I'd seen if they'd just let me go. The bearded man cut me off with a string of profanity and a threat that made my blood run cold. He said if I didn't help them dispose of this body, the next trucker they stopped would be carrying 2 packages instead of 1. The implication was crystal clear. I could either help them with their problem, or I could become part of their problem. They loaded the body into the back of my trailer, wedging it between the pallets of auto parts I was supposed to be delivering. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When they were done, they moved their vehicles and waved me through like nothing had happened. I drove for maybe 20 minutes before the sound started. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking and settling that happens when you're hauling a heavy load. But this was different. It sounded like something was moving around back there, bumping against the walls of the trailer, working its way forward toward the cab. Now I need to explain something about truck design. The trailer is completely separate from the cab where the driver sits. There's no way for sound to travel from the cargo area to where I was driving, not unless something was making an ungodly amount of noise. But I could hear those sounds clear as day, getting louder and more frantic with each passing mile. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over at a rest area and walked around to check my load. When I opened the trailer doors, the body was gone. I climbed inside and searched every inch of that cargo space, moving pallets and checking behind boxes. Nothing. The white-wrapped bundle had vanished completely, leaving behind only some dents in the trailer walls where something had been pounding against them from the inside. I was starting to panic. What if the cops stopped me? How would I explain a missing corpse? What if the narcos thought I'd stolen their package? I closed up the trailer and climbed back into my cab, planning to call the whole thing off and deal with whatever consequences came my way. That's when I saw it. The body was sitting in my passenger seat, still wrapped in white sheets, but somehow upright, like it was wearing the shroud as clothing. Up close, there was no doubt what it was. The shape was unmistakably human, and the smell that filled my cab was the sweet, cloying odor of death. I tried to move it, thinking I'd drag it out of my truck and leave it by the roadside. But the thing was incredibly heavy, dead weight that I couldn't budge even with all my strength. And while I was struggling with it, I saw headlights approaching from down the highway. I slammed the passenger door shut and got back on the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The approaching vehicle turned out to be just another trucker, but the encounter left me paranoid and jumpy. Every set of headlights in my mirrors looked like a police car. The hour deadline came and went while I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway between San Antonio and Laredo. I pulled over at the appointed time, climbed down from my cab, and walked around to the passenger side. But before I could open the door, a Texas Highway Patrol cruiser pulled up behind me with its lights flashing. Two officers got out and approached, asking what I was doing stopped on the shoulder. I told them I was checking a noise in my passenger door, trying to keep my voice steady and normal. That's when we all heard it, a loud thump from inside my cab. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them put his hand on his weapon. They asked what was in my truck, and I honestly didn't know how to answer. The other officer moved me aside and opened the passenger door. The wrapped bundle tumbled out onto the asphalt with a heavy thud. All three of us stared at it for a long moment, nobody wanting to be the first to investigate further. Finally, one of the officers knelt down and started untying the ropes that held the shroud closed. When he pulled the sheets away, we all stepped back in shock. Sand, nothing but sand, maybe 50 pounds of it, scattered across the highway like beach sand after a storm. No body, no bones, no sign that there had ever been anything human inside those sheets. I told the officers it was material I'd been hired to dispose of, leftovers from some kind of themed party. I don't think they believed me, but they couldn't prove otherwise. They checked my license and registration, ran my plates, and eventually let me go with a warning about stopping on the highway. After they left, I stood alone on that dark stretch of road, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I scooped up handfuls of the sand, searching for some clue, some explanation for the impossible thing I'd just experienced. That's when I found them. Buried in the sand were dozens of small objects, cloth dolls stuck full of pins, photographs of people I didn't recognize, scraps of paper with names written in what looked like blood. It was voodoo paraphernalia, the tools of someone who practiced dark magic. I'd heard stories about that kind of thing, mostly from my grandmother who'd grown up in Louisiana and claimed to know about such matters. She told me that sometimes curses were placed on objects, that spiritual energy could be trapped in physical things and manipulated by people who knew the old ways. Looking at those sand-covered dolls and photographs, I began to understand what had really happened. The narcos hadn't just been disposing of a body. They'd been getting rid of cursed materials, supernatural garbage that was too dangerous to keep around. And they'd used me as their unwitting disposal service. The fact that the body had moved on its own, that it had somehow transported itself from the trailer to my cab, suggested that whatever dark energy had been bound up in those materials was very real and very powerful. I was just lucky that the curse hadn't been directed at me personally. I gathered up every scrap of voodoo material I could find and threw it all into a roadside dumpster at the next truck stop. Then I called my dispatcher and reported that my truck had broken down, that I'd need a day or two to get it fixed. I spent that time in a motel room, trying to forget what had happened and telling myself it was all just stress and imagination. But I know what I experienced that night. I know that there are forces in this world that can't be explained by science or logic, dark powers that some people are willing to use against their enemies. And I know that I was incredibly lucky to escape that situation with my life and my sanity intact. I never saw those narcos again, never got another midnight visit from men in expensive cars. Either they found someone else to handle their supernatural disposal needs, or they decided I'd been through enough. Either way, I was grateful to be left alone. These days, I'm more careful about the jobs I take and the people I trust. I've learned that the real world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize, full of ancient evils hiding behind modern faces. And sometimes, the things that go bump in the night aren't supernatural at all. They're just human beings who have chosen to embrace the darkness. My name is Antonio, and before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something about my relationship with horror movies. Ever since that night in the Montana wilderness, I've become obsessed with creature features, werewolf films, Bigfoot documentaries, anything featuring dark, hairy beasts that hunt in the shadows. I watch them not for entertainment, but as research, desperately searching for something that resembles what I saw that terrible night when I lost my best friend. This happened in late September of 2016. I was 38 years old, married to the love of my life, Maria, with a 6-year-old son named Diego, who was the center of our universe. We were going through a rough patch financially. Diego had been sick a lot that year, dealing with juvenile diabetes and a series of respiratory infections that required expensive medications and frequent doctor visits. The medical bills were crushing us. Even with insurance, the copays and deductibles were eating up most of my paycheck. We'd refinanced our house, maxed out our credit cards, and were still falling behind. That's when my best friend Marco stepped in. Marco and I had known each other since we were kids growing up in the same neighborhood in Billings. Life had separated us for a while. He went into the military. I got married young and started driving trucks. But we'd reconnected a few years earlier when he got hired at the same freight company where I worked. He was the kind of friend who'd give you his last dollar without expecting anything in return. When he found out about our financial situation, Marco insisted on lending us $5,000. "Pay me back whenever you can," he said. "No interest, no timeline. Family takes care of family." That loan allowed us to get Diego's medications current and buy us some breathing room. Marco and I both worked night shifts, usually running parallel routes through the mountain passes of Montana and Idaho. We'd joke about racing each other, but we never would have done it. The company monitored our trucks with GPS, and getting caught speeding or deviating from approved routes was a quick way to lose your job. It was a Thursday night in late September when everything went to hell. It started my run about an hour after Marco, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Billings to a dealer in Coeur d'Alene. The autumn weather was perfect, clear skies, no wind, and that crisp mountain air that makes you grateful to be alive. I was making good time on Highway 2, listening to classic rock on the radio and thinking about Diego's upcoming birthday party. Just after midnight, my cell phone rang. Marco's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered it through my Bluetooth headset. "Antonio," he said, and I immediately knew something was wrong. His voice was strained, breathless, like he'd been running. "I need help, brother. Something's chasing me." "What do you mean, chasing you? Where are you?" "My truck went off the road," he gasped. "I'm in the woods somewhere near mile marker 147. There's something out here, man. Something big and black. It's not human." I could hear branches breaking in the background, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. Marco was breathing hard, obviously running, obviously terrified. "Stay on the line," I told him, flooring the accelerator. "I'm about 20 minutes out. Get back to the highway if you can. Flag down another trucker." "I can't," he panted. "The thing cut me off from the road. I'm heading deeper into the woods. God, Antonio, you should see this thing. It's walking on 2 legs, but it's not human. It's got claws and teeth and—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment all I could hear was his labored breathing and the sound of his boots pounding through the forest. "Marco, talk to me, man." "I'm hiding behind a fallen tree," he whispered. "It's looking for me. I can hear it sniffing around. Oh, Jesus, Antonio, tell my family I love them. Tell my son I'm sorry I won't be there to see him grow up." "Don't talk like that," I said, pushing my truck as hard as I dared on the winding mountain highway. "You're going to be fine. I'm almost there." But even as I said it, I could hear something else coming through the phone. A low, rumbling growl that definitely didn't come from any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep and primal, the sound of something that had evolved to kill. "It found me," Marco whispered, and then his voice rose to a shout. "Get away from me. Get back. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life." The phone erupted with the sounds of violence, Marco screaming, something roaring with inhuman fury, the wet sounds of claws tearing through flesh. The attack lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, then silence. "Marco, Marco." Nothing. The line was still open, but all I could hear was the sound of wind through trees and something large moving through the underbrush, getting fainter as it moved away. I found his truck about 15 minutes later, exactly where he'd said it would be near mile marker 147. It had left the highway and crashed through a guardrail, coming to rest about 50 yards into the dense forest of pine and fir trees that covered the mountainside. The driver's door had been torn completely off its hinges and thrown several yards away. I parked my rig on the shoulder and climbed down, grabbing a tire iron from my toolbox. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay in my truck, to call the police and let them handle it. But Marco was my best friend, and there was a chance he was still alive out there, wounded and waiting for help. The beam of my flashlight revealed deep gouges in the side of Marco's truck, claw marks that had torn through steel like it was aluminum foil. Whatever had attacked him was incredibly strong and equipped with natural weapons that could shred metal. I followed the trail of destruction into the woods, calling Marco's name, but getting no response. The forest was eerily quiet, no night birds, no rustling of small animals, like every living thing had fled the area. My flashlight beam danced across the tree trunks, creating shifting shadows that made me jump at every movement. Been searching for maybe 10 minutes when I heard something behind me. A low huffing sound, like a large animal breathing heavily. I spun around with my flashlight and tire iron raised, and that's when I saw it. The creature was standing about 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall when standing upright on its hind legs. Its body was covered in coarse black fur that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, making it difficult to see clearly. The head was wolf-like but larger, with a pronounced snout full of teeth that gleamed white in the darkness. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They were intelligent, calculating, filled with a malevolent awareness that no animal should possess. This wasn't just a predator. It was something that enjoyed killing, something that took pleasure in the hunt. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the thing opened its mouth and let out a roar that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The sound was so loud and primal that I felt it in my bones, a vibration that turned my muscles to jelly and made my teeth ache. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a madman, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I tried to find my way back to the highway. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing, its heavy footsteps pounding against the forest floor, getting closer with each stride. I burst out of the tree line just as a pickup truck came around the curve, its headlights sweeping across the scene. The driver must have seen me stumbling toward the road, wild-eyed and terrified, because he swerved and hit the creature head-on. The impact sent the beast tumbling through the air, but it wasn't killed. I watched in horror as it picked itself up, shook its massive head, and limped back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness like it had never existed. The pickup truck had 2 occupants, a middle-aged rancher and his adult son who'd been driving back from a late dinner in town. They'd seen the whole thing and immediately called 911 while I sat on their tailgate, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. The police and search teams found Marco's body the next morning, about half a mile from where his truck had crashed. The official report listed the cause of death as an animal attack, probably a large bear or mountain lion. But I saw what was left of my best friend, and no normal animal could have done that kind of damage. Authorities interviewed me extensively, but I didn't tell them about the creature I'd seen. Who would have believed me? Instead, I said I'd heard Marco calling for help, found his wrecked truck, and been attacked by something in the darkness. Technically, it was all true. I quit my job the next week and moved my family to Phoenix. I couldn't stand the thought of driving those mountain highways again, couldn't risk encountering that thing a second time. Maria understood. She'd seen the change in me, the way I jumped at shadows and woke up screaming from nightmares. Marco's funeral was the hardest day of my life. His wife, Carmen, and their 8-year-old son, Miguel, were destroyed by grief. I gave the eulogy, talked about what a good man Marco had been, how he'd always been there for the people he loved. But I couldn't tell them the truth about how he died, couldn't explain that their husband and father had been killed by something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I think about calling one of those cryptozoology researchers, the people who investigate Bigfoot sightings and other unexplained phenomena. What would be the point? Marco is still dead, and that creature is still out there in the Montana wilderness, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to break down on a dark mountain highway. I've seen dozens of werewolf movies since that night, everything from classic Universal monster films to modern CGI spectacles. None of them get it right. They make the beasts look too human, too sympathetic. The real thing was pure predator, ancient and evil, and utterly without mercy. Worst part is knowing that it's still out there, probably hunting other innocent people who have the misfortune to cross its path. And there's nothing I can do about it, except remember my friend and warn others to stay away from those dark mountain roads, where things that science can't explain still roam free. Marco died trying to make an honest living, hauling freight through the American wilderness to support his family. He deserved better than to become prey for some nightmare creature that shouldn't exist. But in this world, the good don't always survive, and sometimes the monsters win. All I can do is carry his memory and hope that someday, someone braver than me will find that thing and put an end to its reign of terror. Until then, I'll keep watching those movies, searching for answers in fiction, since the truth is too terrible for most people to accept. I've always been skeptical about UFO stories. Growing up in rural Wyoming during the 1980s, I heard plenty of tales from neighbors and coworkers about strange lights in the sky. But I chalked it all up to overactive imaginations, too much whiskey, or simple misidentification of aircraft and satellites. Even when my own family members claimed to have seen unexplained phenomena, I remained firmly planted in the camp of the non-believers. That changed on a clear October night in 1984, when I was 32 years old and had been driving long-haul trucks for about 8 years. I was married to Susan, had 2 young kids. Tommy was 10 and Sarah was 8, and we lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Casper. Life was good, predictable, grounded in the everyday realities of mortgage payments and little league games. The run that changed everything was supposed to be routine. Pick up a load of machinery parts in Denver, haul them to a factory in Salt Lake City, be back home by Friday evening in time for Tommy's football game. Simple, straightforward, the kind of milk run that veteran drivers could do in their sleep. I left home at 5 p.m. on a Thursday, planning to drive through the night and make the delivery Friday morning. Susan had packed me a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches, kissed me goodbye at the front door like she had hundreds of times before. The kids were doing homework at the kitchen table, and everything was exactly as it should be in our small-town American life. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, crystal clear skies, and a harvest moon that cast everything in silver light. I was making good time on Interstate 80, listening to country music on the radio and thinking about maybe taking the family to Yellowstone for a weekend camping trip when hunting season ended. My son Tommy had been excited about a story his science teacher, Mr. Peterson, had told the class that week. Peterson claimed he'd seen 2 oval-shaped objects flying over his house while he was watering his garden early Tuesday morning. According to Tommy, the teacher had described them in vivid detail: metallic, silent, moving in perfect formation at impossible speeds. I'd laughed it off when Tommy told me, the way you laugh off any tall tale that stretches credibility too far. But as I drove through the Wyoming darkness that night, I found myself thinking about Peterson's story, wondering what he'd actually seen. Probably military aircraft from Warren Air Force Base, I told myself. The government was always testing new technology, and they didn't advertise their flight schedules to the general public. At the trucking company where I worked, a couple of my fellow drivers, Ray Martinez and Bob Wheeler, had been claiming for months that they'd seen unusual lights during their overnight runs. According to them, these weren't ordinary aircraft lights, but something else entirely. Bright, pulsing objects that moved in ways that defied conventional physics. Most of us who heard these stories figured Ray and Bob were either pulling our legs or had been hitting the truck stop coffee a little too hard. But their descriptions were remarkably consistent, and both men had sterling reputations for honesty and reliability. Still, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and flying saucers seemed pretty extraordinary to a pragmatic trucker from Wyoming. It was just past 10 p.m. when I crested a hill about 50 miles east of Rock Springs and saw something that made me ease off the accelerator. Far ahead in the distance, maybe 5 miles away, a bright red light was moving horizontally across the highway. At first, I assumed it was another truck's taillights, but as I watched, the light suddenly accelerated to impossible speeds and shot across the landscape like a meteor. I blinked hard, shook my head, and told myself I'd just witnessed some kind of optical illusion. Maybe the light from an aircraft had reflected off something metallic, creating the appearance of movement where none existed. These things happened on long night drives, fatigue, and highway hypnosis could play tricks on your perception. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. This time, the red light appeared to be moving toward me, approaching from the opposite direction at tremendous speed. As it got closer, I could see that it wasn't attached to any kind of vehicle I recognized. It was just a brilliant red orb, perfectly round, flying about 200 feet above the highway with no visible means of propulsion. The light passed overhead so quickly that I barely had time to register what I was seeing. But in that brief moment, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a deep, primal fear that seemed to come from somewhere beyond rational thought. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from whatever that thing was. I pulled over at the next rest area and sat in my cab for 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Experimental military aircraft, whether balloons with flares attached, some kind of atmospheric phenomenon I didn't understand. But none of those explanations felt adequate. When I got back on the road, I found myself constantly scanning the sky, looking for more of those impossible lights. I didn't have to wait long. About 20 miles further west, I saw not one but 3 lights moving in perfect formation across the star-filled sky. They were dimmer than the red one I'd seen earlier, more of a pale yellow color, but their movement patterns were equally inexplicable. It would hover motionless for several seconds, then suddenly dart in different directions at speeds that would have killed any human pilot. I was so focused on watching the lights that I almost missed seeing the 2 cars that had pulled over on the shoulder ahead of me. As I approached, I could see people standing outside their vehicles, pointing up at the sky. I slowed down and rolled down my window, and one of them, a middle-aged man in a cowboy hat, walked over to my truck. "You seeing this too?" he asked, gesturing toward the lights above us. "Yeah," I said. "Any idea what they are?" He shook his head. "Been watching them for about 15 minutes. They're not like any aircraft I've ever seen. Military maybe, but if so, it's technology way beyond anything they've admitted to having." The other vehicle contained a family, parents, and 2 teenagers who were equally mystified by what they were witnessing. We all stood there for maybe half an hour, watching the lights perform maneuvers that seemed to mock the laws of physics as I understood them. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights gathered together in a tight formation and shot straight up into the sky, disappearing among the stars in a matter of seconds. I exchanged contact information with the other witnesses and continued on my route, but my mind was racing. Whatever I'd seen that night challenged everything I thought I knew about what was possible in our world. The experience left me feeling small and insignificant, like a child who'd suddenly realized that the universe was far stranger and more complex than anyone had ever told him. The delivery in Salt Lake City went smoothly, but on the drive home Friday afternoon, I found myself taking a detour. Instead of heading straight back to Casper on the interstate, I drove to the approximate location where I'd seen the lights the night before. It was a desolate stretch of high desert, the kind of empty landscape that makes Wyoming famous for its wide-open spaces. I parked my truck and walked around for an hour, looking for any evidence of what I'd witnessed: burn marks on the ground, unusual debris, anything that might provide a clue. I didn't find anything concrete, but there was something unsettling about the area. The silence was too complete, too absolute. Even the wind seemed muted there, and I noticed that there were no insects, no birds, no signs of wildlife at all. It was as if every living thing had fled from that place. When I got home that evening, I told Susan about what I'd seen, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She listened politely, nodded in the right places, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. To her credit, she didn't come right out and suggest that I'd been hallucinating or drinking, but the implication was there. The kids were more receptive to my story, especially Tommy, who immediately connected it to his teachers, citing earlier that week. But even their enthusiasm couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line, that I'd become one of those people who claimed to have seen things that rational society preferred to ignore. Over the next few weeks, I did some research at the local library, reading everything I could find about UFO sightings in Wyoming and the surrounding states. I was surprised to discover how many credible witnesses had reported similar experiences: pilots, police officers, military personnel, people with everything to lose and nothing to gain by making up stories about flying saucers. I also learned about a phenomenon called missing time, where witnesses reported gaps in their memory following UFO encounters. As I thought back to that night in October, I realized that my own timeline didn't quite add up. The drive from Denver to Salt Lake City should have taken about 9 hours, but according to my logbook, it had taken nearly 12. I couldn't account for those missing 3 hours. A month after my sighting, I received a visit that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was washing my truck in the driveway when a black sedan pulled up in front of our house. 2 men in dark suits got out and walked toward me with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they weren't there to sell insurance or ask for directions. They were identical in height and build, with pale skin and expressionless faces that seemed carved from stone. Their voices had a strange, metallic quality that made them difficult to understand, and their eyes never seemed to blink. "Mr. Johnson," one of them said, "we understand you witnessed some unusual aerial phenomena last month." I hadn't told anyone outside my immediate family about the sighting, and I certainly hadn't filed any official reports. How these men knew about my experience was a mystery that sent chills down my spine. "We're here to remind you," the second man continued, "that certain observations are better left undiscussed, for the sake of national security and for your own well-being." They didn't threaten me directly, but the implication was clear enough. I was being warned to keep my mouth shut about what I'd seen that night. The men climbed back into their sedan and drove away without another word, leaving me standing in my driveway with a head full of questions and a growing sense of unease. True to their advice or warning, I never spoke publicly about my UFO encounter. I didn't contact any researchers, didn't write letters to newspapers, didn't join any of the civilian UFO investigation groups that were active in those days. I kept my story to myself and tried to get on with my normal life, but normal was no longer an option. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways, opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered before. I found myself paying attention to stories about government cover-ups, secret military programs, and the possibility that we weren't alone in the universe. Years passed. Susan and I divorced not because of the UFO incident, but because our marriage had been falling apart for other reasons long before that October night. The kids grew up and moved away, Tommy to college in Colorado, Sarah to a job in California. I eventually retired from trucking and bought a small ranch outside of town, where I could live quietly and think about the mysteries I'd encountered during my years on the road. Now I'm an old man, and most of the people who might have cared about my story are gone. Susan passed away 5 years ago from cancer. Tommy died in a car accident in 2003. Sarah calls occasionally, but she's busy with her own family and has little time for her father's old stories about strange lights in the sky. That's why I'm finally breaking my silence. The men in black suits, whoever they were, can't hurt me anymore. I'm 73 years old, living alone with my memories and my dogs, and I don't have much left to lose. what I saw that night in 1984 was real. I wasn't hallucinating, wasn't drunk, wasn't suffering from highway hypnosis or any other convenient explanation. I witnessed technology that was decades ahead of anything our own government possessed, operated by intelligences that remain utterly mysterious to this day. Universe is stranger and more wonderful than most people are willing to admit. We're not alone out there among the stars, and sooner or later, the truth about that reality is going to come out. When it does, I hope humanity is ready for the revelation that we're not the masters of creation we've always believed ourselves to be. Until then, all I can do is tell my story and hope that someone somewhere will take it seriously. Because the truth, no matter how impossible it seems, deserves to be heard. I've been a God-fearing man my entire life, raised in a small Baptist church in rural Montana, where faith wasn't just something you practiced on Sundays. It was woven into the fabric of your daily existence. Every morning, I'd thank the Lord for another day of life and ask for His protection on the dangerous highways where I made my living. Every evening, I'd pray for my family's safety and health, trusting that God would watch over us as long as we remained faithful to His teachings. That unwavering faith was tested on the night of October 31st, 2014 Halloween night, when I learned that sometimes the darkest forces in the universe can touch even the most innocent lives, regardless of how devoutly we believe or how righteously we try to live. My name is Samuel, and I'd been driving long-haul trucks for 12 years by that point. I was 41 years old, married to my high school sweetheart Rebecca, and blessed with two beautiful sons, Michael, who was 9, and David, who was 7. We lived in a modest farmhouse outside Great Falls, surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, and a sky so big it seemed to hold all of God's promises. The boys had been planning their Halloween costumes for weeks. Michael wanted to be Superman. He'd seen one of the old Christopher Reeve movies and become obsessed with the idea of being a hero who could save everyone. David had chosen to dress as a pirate, complete with an eye patch and plastic sword, though he'd refused to let Rebecca paint a beard on his face because he said it would be too scratchy. I'd promised to take them trick-or-treating myself that year. Rebecca had been hinting about it for months, saying how important it was for me to be home for these special occasions, how the boys needed their father around for more than just the paycheck he brought home. She was right, of course. My job kept me away from home 3 weeks out of every month, and I'd missed too many birthdays, school plays, and bedtime stories. But at 4 p.m. on Halloween afternoon, my dispatcher called with an emergency run. One of our regular drivers had been in a car accident, nothing serious, just a fender bender in his personal vehicle. But he'd suffered a mild concussion and couldn't make his scheduled delivery. The load was time-sensitive medical equipment bound for a hospital in Billings, the kind of cargo that couldn't wait for Monday morning. "I know it's Halloween, Sam," my dispatcher said apologetically, "but you're the only driver available who's certified to handle medical freight. The hospital needs this equipment by midnight for a surgery tomorrow morning." Rebecca wasn't happy about it, and neither were the boys. Michael looked like he was about to cry when I explained that I wouldn't be able to go trick-or-treating with them. David just stared at me with those big brown eyes that always made me feel like the world's worst father when I had to disappoint him. "I'll make it up to you," I promised them both, kneeling down to their level in our living room. Next weekend, we'll go to that new amusement park in Helena, and you can ride all the roller coasters you want. Rebecca forced a smile and said she'd take the boys around the neighborhood herself, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. We'd had this conversation before about priorities, about the importance of family time, about whether the money I made was worth the time I lost with the people I loved most. The drive to the company yard was heavy with guilt. I kept seeing Michael's disappointed face in my rearview mirror, kept hearing David's quiet, "Okay, Dad," when I told them I had to work instead of taking them trick-or-treating. But what choice did I have? The hospital needed the equipment, and we needed the overtime pay. Rebecca's part-time job at the school district didn't cover much, and with winter coming, we'd need every dollar for heating oil and the boys' winter clothes. The load was already waiting when I arrived at the yard. Several pallets of diagnostic imaging equipment that would allow doctors to see inside patients' bodies with remarkable clarity. My supervisor handed me the paperwork and reminded me about the midnight deadline, then wished me luck driving on Halloween night. "Lot of drunk drivers out there tonight," he warned. "Kids hopped up on sugar, adults hopped up on booze. Keep your eyes open and your CB on. And Sam, thanks for taking this run. I know it wasn't easy leaving your family tonight." The first 100 miles passed without incident. I listened to a Christian radio station out of Great Falls, sang along with old hymns that reminded me of Sunday services with my grandfather, and tried not to think about what Michael and David were doing at that moment. Probably walking through our neighborhood with Rebecca, their treat bags getting heavier with each house they visited. The autumn night was beautiful in its own way, clear skies filled with stars, a full moon that cast silver light over the Montana landscape, and that crisp mountain air that made you grateful to be alive. I rolled down my windows despite the cold, wanting to stay alert and connected to the world around me. But as I drove deeper into the Beartooth Mountains, something began to feel wrong. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against my headlights like a living thing. The moon, which had been bright and comforting earlier, disappeared behind clouds that hadn't been in the weather forecast. Even my truck's headlights seemed dimmed, as if they were struggling against some invisible force that was swallowing the light. I tried to dismiss these feelings as products of guilt and fatigue. Halloween had always made me uncomfortable. All that celebration of death and evil spirits went against everything I'd been taught about the power of faith and prayer. But tonight felt different, more personal, like the darkness itself was reaching out for something I held dear. At 11:30 p.m., as I was navigating a winding mountain pass about 20 miles from Billings, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the highway, illuminated by my headlights, were two small figures in costumes. Children holding trick-or-treat bags, impossibly far from any house or town. As I got closer, I could see their faces clearly. A boy dressed as Superman and another wearing a pirate costume. Michael and David. But that was impossible. They were back home in Great Falls with Rebecca, probably asleep in their beds by now with stomachs full of candy. Yet there they were, standing on a deserted mountain, highway 300 miles from home, looking exactly as they had when I'd left them that afternoon. I slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my truck, calling their names. But as I ran toward them, they began to change. Their innocent faces twisted into expressions of terror and pain, their costumes became torn and bloody, and their eyes filled with an accusation that cut me to the bone. "Daddy," Michael said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a grave, "why did you leave us? Why weren't you there to protect us?" Before I could answer, both boys vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving me standing alone on an empty highway, with my heart hammering against my ribs. I climbed back into my truck with shaking hands and immediately called home on my cell phone. It rang and rang, but nobody answered. I tried Rebecca's cell phone with the same result, straight to voicemail, like the phone was turned off or out of range. Panic began to set in as I continued toward Billings, driving faster than I should have on those winding mountain roads. I tried calling home every few minutes, but the result was always the same: no answer, just the hollow ring of phones that would never be picked up. I made the delivery to the hospital with 15 minutes to spare, but I barely remember the process of unloading the equipment or getting the signatures on my paperwork. All I could think about was getting home to my family, proving to myself that what I'd seen on the mountain highway had been nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination. The drive back to Great Falls was a nightmare of worry and self-recrimination. I pushed my truck harder than I ever had before, taking curves at dangerous speeds and passing slower vehicles on blind hills. Every mile seemed to take forever, and my cell phone remained stubbornly silent despite my repeated attempts to reach Rebecca. I pulled into our driveway at 3:47 a.m. to find a Montana State Police cruiser parked in front of our house. Its red and blue lights painting our white farmhouse in alternating colors of blood and bruise. Officer Janet Morrison was waiting for me on our front porch, her face grave with the kind of expression that police officers learn to wear when they have to deliver news that will destroy someone's world. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but there's been an accident." The details came in fragments that my mind struggled to process. A drunk driver running a red light at the intersection of Main and 7th. Rebecca's car struck on the passenger side, right where the boys had been sitting. The impact had been instantaneous and catastrophic, no suffering. The officer assured me, though I'm not sure if that was meant to be a comfort. "Your wife is in critical condition at Benefice Hospital," Officer Morrison continued. "She's alive, but her injuries are severe. As for your sons..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I already knew. Somehow, on that mountain highway 300 miles away, I'd been given a preview of the tragedy that was unfolding at home while I was delivering medical equipment to strangers. The supernatural appearance of Michael and David hadn't been a hallucination or a stress-induced vision. It had been their spirits, reaching out to me in their final moments, asking the question that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Why weren't you there to protect us? Rebecca survived her injuries, but never fully recovered. The trauma of losing both boys, combined with the physical damage from the accident, left her a shell of the vibrant woman I'd married. She blamed me, and I didn't argue with her assessment. If I'd been home on Halloween night instead of chasing overtime pay, maybe we would have left the house 5 minutes later. Maybe we would have missed that intersection at the exact moment when a drunk driver decided to run a red light. Our marriage lasted another year before Rebecca asked for a divorce. She moved back to her parents' house in Minnesota, and I've seen her exactly twice since then. Once for the divorce proceedings, and once at Michael's grave on what would have been his 12th birthday. I still drive trucks, though I've never again taken a run on Halloween night. I still go to church most Sundays, though my prayers now sound more like arguments with God than expressions of faith. I still believe in the power of the divine, but I no longer trust that goodness will always triumph over evil, or that innocent children will be protected simply because their father says his prayers and tries to live righteously. The supernatural encounter on that mountain highway taught me that the spirit world is real, that consciousness can transcend physical death, and that love is strong enough to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. But it also taught me that faith alone isn't enough to protect the people we love from the random cruelties of an indifferent universe. Sometimes I wonder if Michael and David are still out there somewhere, waiting for their daddy to come home from one last run. Sometimes I think I see them in the distance when I'm driving through the Montana darkness. Two small figures in Halloween costumes standing by the side of the road. And sometimes, on the quietest nights when the highway stretches empty ahead of me and the stars seem close enough to touch, I can almost hear their voices calling my name across the vast darkness, asking why I wasn't there when they needed me most. The answer to that question is simple and terrible and true. Because I chose work over family, money over love, and responsibility to strangers over devotion to the people who mattered most. That choice cost me everything I held dear, and no amount of faith or prayer will ever bring them back. My name is Lewis, and the story I'm about to tell you isn't about ghosts or supernatural creatures. It's about something far more terrifying, the very real evil that human beings are capable of when they decide that money is more important than human life. This happened to me and my family in the summer of 2016, when I learned that the sins of the father can destroy the innocent, and that some debts are paid in blood rather than currency. I was 35 years old at the time, married to Alina, the love of my life, and we had a 6-year-old daughter named Sophia, who was the light of our world. We lived in a small house in Tucson, where I worked for a regional trucking company hauling freight between Arizona and California. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and allowed Alina to stay home with Sophia during her preschool years. My father, Roberto, had died 2 years earlier from a heart attack. He'd been a good man in many ways, a hard worker who'd immigrated to the United States from Mexico in the 1970s and built a small but successful auto repair shop from nothing. He taught me the value of honest work and the importance of family, lessons that I tried to pass on to Sophia despite my frequent absences on the road. What I didn't know was that my father had been keeping a secret from our family for the last decade of his life, a secret that would nearly destroy everything Alina and I had worked to build. The trouble started on a Tuesday evening in late July. I just returned from a 3-day run to Los Angeles and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with my wife and daughter. Sophia was playing in the backyard while Alina prepared dinner, and everything felt peaceful and normal in our small corner of the world. That's when the men came to our door. There were 4 of them, all dressed in expensive suits despite the 100-degree Arizona heat. Their leader was a man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes like chips of black ice. He introduced himself as Mr. Gutierrez and said he was there to discuss a business matter related to my late father. I invited them into our living room, thinking this might be about some unpaid bill or unfinished work from my father's shop. But as soon as they sat down, I knew this was something much more serious. These weren't businessmen, they were predators, and they'd come to collect something that my father had apparently owed them. Your father was a good customer for many years, Mr. Gutierrez began, his voice soft and conversational. He understood the importance of paying protection fees on time, of maintaining good relationships with the people who kept his business safe. Protection fees. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father had been paying extortion money to these criminals, probably for years, and somehow I'd never suspected anything. But in the last months of his life, Mr. Gutierrez continued, Roberto fell behind on his payments. He was sick, distracted, and perhaps he thought his illness would excuse him from his obligations. Unfortunately, debts don't disappear when people die. They transfer to the next generation. Alina had wandered into the living room during this conversation, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she began to understand what was happening. Mr. Gutierrez noticed her presence and smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Your father owed us $25,000 when he died, he said. With interest and penalties, that amount has now grown to $40,000. We've been patient, but our patience has limits. $40,000. We didn't have anything close to that amount in savings, and Alina and I both knew it. Our mortgage, car payments, and Sophia's expenses consumed almost every dollar I earned, leaving little room for unexpected costs of any kind. I don't have that kind of money, I told them honestly. My father never told me about any of this, if I'd known. What you knew or didn't know is irrelevant, Mr. Gutierrez interrupted. The debt exists, and it will be paid. The only question is how. One of his companions opened a briefcase and pulled out several photographs. They were surveillance pictures of Sophia at her daycare, Alina at the grocery store, me climbing into my truck at the company yard. The message was clear. They knew where we lived, where we worked, where our daughter spent her days. We're reasonable people, Mr. Gutierrez said. We understand that $40,000 is a significant sum. We're willing to accept payment in installments, provided you demonstrate good faith by making a substantial down payment within the next week. And if I can't, I asked, though I already knew the answer. His smile grew wider and colder. Then we'll be forced to pursue alternative collection methods that might be unpleasant for everyone involved. They left their business card, if you could call it that, and drove away in 2 black Escalades with tinted windows. Alina and I spent the rest of the evening holding each other and trying to figure out how we'd gotten into this nightmare situation. Over the next few days, I made some discreet inquiries about Mr. Gutierrez and his organization. What I learned terrified me. They were connected to one of the major drug cartels that operated along the Mexican border, and they had a reputation for extreme violence against people who failed to pay their debts. People had disappeared, families had been destroyed, and the authorities seemed powerless or unwilling to stop them. I considered going to the police, but the stories I'd heard about cartel infiltration of law enforcement made me hesitant. How could I know which cops were clean and which ones were on the cartel's payroll? How could I risk Sophia's safety on the hope that the system would protect us? Instead, I tried to raise the money through legitimate means. I borrowed against my truck, took a second mortgage on our house, and asked my mother for everything she had in her savings account. But even liquidating every asset we owned only got me to about $15,000. Nowhere near the $40,000 they were demanding. The week deadline came and went. On the 8th day, Mr. Gutierrez called my cell phone while I was on a run to Phoenix. "You've disappointed me, Louis," he said. "I was hoping we could resolve this matter amicably, but you forced my hand. Tonight, you and your wife will experience a demonstration of what happens to people who don't honor their obligations." The line went dead, and I immediately tried calling Alina at home. No answer. I tried her cell phone, then the landline again, then Sophia's daycare. Nothing. Every call went straight to voicemail or rang endlessly without being picked up. I abandoned my load in Phoenix and drove home like a madman, pushing my truck well beyond the speed limit, and praying to every saint I could remember from my childhood. But when I arrived at our house, everything looked normal. Alina's car was in the driveway, the lights were on, and there was no sign of forced entry or struggle. I found them in our bedroom, Alina and Sophia tied up, but unharmed, lying on the bed with duct tape over their mouths and terror in their eyes. A note on the nightstand explained that this was just a warning, a preview of what would happen if I didn't come up with the money within 48 hours. That night, while Alina held our sleeping daughter, we made the hardest decision of our lives. We couldn't fight these people, couldn't run from them, and couldn't count on the authorities to protect us. The only option was to pay them what they demanded, even if it meant losing everything we'd worked for. Alina's parents lived in San Diego, and they agreed to wire us the remaining $25,000 from their retirement savings. It was money they'd planned to live on in their golden years, but they were willing to sacrifice their future to protect their granddaughter's present. The handoff took place in the parking lot of a truck stop outside Tucson. Mr. Gutierrez arrived with the same 3 men who'd visited our house, and I gave him a cashier's check for the full $40,000. He examined it carefully, made a phone call to verify the funds, then nodded his approval. "Your father's debt is now settled," he said. "As long as you don't cause us any problems in the future, you and your family will be left alone." But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that this wasn't really over. Men like him don't just walk away from a family they've successfully intimidated. We'd always be potential targets, always be vulnerable to future demands. That's when I made the second hardest decision of my life. 2 weeks after paying off my father's debt, I moved Alina and Sophia to San Diego to live with her parents, while I figured out our next move. Within a month, I'd found a job with a California-based trucking company and relocated our entire lives to the West Coast. We lost our house in Tucson, forfeited thousands of dollars in moving costs, and started over from scratch in a city where we knew almost no one. But we were alive, we were together, and we were 300 miles away from Mr. Gutierrez and his organization. The aftermath of this experience changed our family in fundamental ways. Alina developed anxiety and depression that required months of therapy to overcome. Sophia had nightmares for almost a year, afraid that the bad men would come back to hurt her mommy and daddy. As for me, I learned to live with the constant low-level paranoia that comes from knowing how easily your peaceful life can be shattered by forces beyond your control. But we survived. We rebuilt our lives in San Diego, made new friends, found new routines, and gradually began to trust that we were safe. Alina went back to school and became a certified medical technician. Sophia thrived in her new school and made friends quickly, the way children do when they're resilient and loved. 3 years later, I learned that Mr. Gutierrez and 2 of his associates had been killed in what the newspapers described as a cartel power struggle. Their bodies were found in the Arizona desert, and according to the reports, their deaths had been particularly brutal. I felt no satisfaction in their demise, only a profound relief that they could never again threaten my family. The experience taught me several hard lessons about the world we live in. First, that evil often wears a human face and speaks in reasonable tones while planning unconscionable acts. Second, that the sins of our parents can follow us into the next generation, creating debts we never agreed to incur. And third, that sometimes survival requires abandoning everything you've worked for and starting over in a place where your past can't find you. I also learned about the insidious nature of extortion and how it traps honest people in cycles of fear and dependency. My father had probably started by paying what seemed like a small amount for protection of his business, never realizing that he was signing himself and his family up for a lifetime of vulnerability. Each payment had made it harder to stop. Each year had increased his debt, until he was caught in a web that only death could break. Except that even death wasn't enough to free us from the consequences of his choices. The protection racket that destroyed our peace of mind is unfortunately common in many parts of America, though most people prefer not to think about it. Small business owners, restaurant managers, shopkeepers. Thousands of honest, hardworking people pay tribute to criminal organizations just for the right to operate without being harassed, robbed, or burned out. The police know it happens. The politicians know it happens. But the system seems powerless to stop it because the victims are too afraid to testify, and the criminals are too well connected to prosecute effectively. What makes this type of evil particularly insidious is how it masquerades as a business transaction. Mr. Gutierrez and his men didn't present themselves as thugs or terrorists. They wore expensive suits, spoke politely, and framed their demands in the language of legitimate debt collection. They made it seem almost reasonable that I should be responsible for my father's obligations, that a 6-year-old girl should suffer for the choices her grandfather had made before she was even born. But beneath the civilized veneer was a willingness to commit acts of shocking violence against innocent people. The photographs of Sophia at her daycare weren't just surveillance. They were a promise that a little girl would be hurt or killed if her father didn't comply with their demands. The fact that they could make such threats with calm voices and pleasant smiles revealed a level of moral corruption that no amount of money or power can justify. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd made different choices during those terrifying weeks in Tucson. What if I'd gone to the FBI instead of trying to handle it myself? What if I'd refused to pay and called their bluff? What if I'd tried to fight back, to protect my family through violence rather than capitulation? The truth is, I'll never know. I made the choices that seemed most likely to keep Alina and Sophia alive, and I have to live with the consequences of those decisions. Sometimes, I think I took the coward's way out, that I should have stood up to them regardless of the risk. Other times I'm grateful that I had enough sense to recognize when I was outgunned and outmaneuvered. What I do know is that family comes first, before pride, before principle, before everything else that we tell ourselves is important. Mr. Gutierrez and his organization were evil, but they understood something fundamental about human nature. Most people will do anything to protect the people they love, even if it means sacrificing their own dignity and financial security. The $40,000 we paid to settle my father's debt was just money painful to lose, but ultimately replaceable. The years of anxiety and fear that followed were harder to overcome, but we managed that too with time and professional help. What we couldn't replace was our sense of security, our belief that good people who work hard and follow the rules will be left alone to live their lives in peace. That innocence was gone forever, replaced by a hard-earned wisdom about the darkness that exists at the margins of civilized society. But we also learned about the strength that comes from facing adversity together, about the bonds that can't be broken by threats or violence, and about the courage that ordinary people can find when protecting the ones they love. Sophia is 15 now, a bright, confident young woman who wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up. She has no memory of those terrifying weeks in Tucson, and Alina and I have never told her the full story of why we left Arizona so suddenly. Someday, when she's older, we'll explain what happened and why her grandfather's choices nearly destroyed our family. But for now, we're content to let her believe that sometimes families just need fresh starts in new places. Alina and I are stronger than we were before this ordeal tested us. The experience forced us to lean on each other in ways we'd never had to before, to make decisions together that neither of us could have faced alone. We learned that love isn't just a feeling. It's a commitment to stand together against whatever darkness the world might throw at you. And we learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting back against evil, but recognizing when you're overmatched and making the hard choice to walk away. There's no shame in retreating when retreat means survival. No dishonor in starting over when starting over means your family gets to stay together. The truck routes I drive now take me through California's Central Valley, past farms and small towns that remind me of the peaceful life we're building in San Diego. I still love the solitude of the highway, the rhythm of wheels on asphalt, and the sense of purpose that comes from delivering cargo to people who need it. But I'm more careful now about the routes I take and the loads I accept, more aware of the fine line between legitimate business and the criminal enterprises that prey on honest working people. Because I learned the hard way that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic music and obvious villains. Sometimes it comes to your door wearing a business suit and speaking in reasonable tones about debts that need to be paid. And when it does, the only thing that matters is protecting the people you love, no matter what it costs, and no matter where you have to go to keep them safe. My name is Frank, and I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years across the highways of America. In all that time, I've seen my share of strange things, unexplained lights, mysterious hitchhikers, and phenomena that challenge everything you think you know about the world we live in. But nothing prepared me for what happened during my second week driving a brand new Kenworth that the company had assigned to me after my previous truck was totaled in an accident that nearly cost me my life. This story takes place in the winter of 2018, when I was 39 years old and going through what you might generously call a rough patch in my personal life. I was recently divorced, living alone in a studio apartment in Memphis, and struggling to rebuild my sense of purpose after my marriage fell apart. My ex-wife had taken our daughter to live with her parents in Florida, and I saw Kelly maybe 3 times a year if I was lucky. The trucking company I worked for had given me the new rig as compensation for the accident that had put me in the hospital for 2 weeks with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The crash hadn't been my fault. A mechanical failure in my previous truck's braking system had caused me to rear-end another vehicle during a traffic jam outside Little Rock. The company's insurance covered my medical bills, but they also upgraded my equipment to one of their newest trucks as a gesture of goodwill. The Kenworth was beautiful midnight blue with chrome exhaust stacks and a sleeper cab that was more luxurious than my apartment. It had all the latest safety features, satellite radio, GPS navigation, and enough power to pull any load they could legally put on a trailer. Driving it was like piloting a spaceship compared to the worn-out equipment I'd been used to. My first run in the new truck was a routine haul from Memphis to Atlanta, carrying automotive parts to a manufacturing plant outside the city. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and everything went smoothly. I made the delivery on time, got a good night's sleep in a truck stop near Macon, and started the return trip feeling optimistic about my future with the company. But on my second run, a load of electronics bound for a distribution center in Birmingham. Something happened that made me question whether the new truck came with more than just upgraded technology. I was driving through rural Alabama on a moonless night in early December, somewhere between Montgomery and Birmingham, on a stretch of highway that seemed to exist in its own pocket of darkness. The road was practically empty, just me and the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction. I had my satellite radio tuned to a classic rock station, and I was making good time despite a light fog that had rolled in from the Tennessee Valley. That's when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was interference from the radio, a high-pitched whining sound that seemed to be coming through the speakers. But when I turned the radio off, the sound continued. It was definitely coming from inside my cab, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. As I listened more carefully, I realized what I was hearing: a baby crying. Not the angry wailing that babies do when they're hungry or wet, but the heartbroken sobbing of a child in genuine distress. The sound was faint but persistent, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere behind me, in the area where the cab connected to the trailer. I pulled over at the next rest area and grabbed my flashlight to inspect the truck. The logical explanation was that I had a stowaway, maybe a homeless person with a baby who'd climbed into my trailer while I was loading in Memphis. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to hitch a free ride in a cargo trailer. But when I opened the trailer doors and searched every inch of the cargo space, I found nothing. Just neatly stacked pallets of electronics secured with load straps, exactly as they'd been when I left Memphis. No sign that anyone had been inside, no indication that the load had been disturbed. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for several minutes, listening carefully. The crying had stopped while I was outside, but as soon as I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, it began again. Soft, mournful, and impossible to ignore. For the rest of the drive to Birmingham, I was accompanied by the sound of that invisible child. The crying would start and stop at seemingly random intervals, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers, and sometimes swelling to heartbreaking sobs that made it difficult to concentrate on the road. I completed the delivery and spent the day trying to convince myself that the whole experience had been stress-related hallucinations brought on by my recent divorce and the trauma of the accident. Maybe the head injury had caused some kind of lingering neurological damage. Maybe I was having auditory hallucinations triggered by guilt over being separated from my own daughter. But on my third run in the new truck, a load of furniture bound for Jacksonville, it happened again. This time, the crying started almost immediately after I left the Memphis yard. But there was something different about it, something that made my skin crawl. The sound wasn't just coming from the back of the cab anymore. It seemed to be moving around, as if someone was carrying a crying baby from one end of the trailer to the other. I tried turning up the radio to drown out the sound, but it didn't help. The crying seemed to cut through any other noise, demanding attention like a real child in genuine distress. By the time I reached the Georgia border, I was so rattled that I called my dispatcher and reported a mechanical problem that would require an overnight stay at a truck stop. That night, parked at a Flying J outside Macon, I did some research on my laptop. I searched for information about the truck's previous history, trying to find out if anything unusual had happened before it was assigned to me. What I found chilled me to the bone. The truck had been special ordered 2 years earlier by a driver named Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old from Houston who'd been killed in the same type of mechanical failure that had totaled my previous rig. But Marcus hadn't been driving alone when he died. According to the accident report, his 6-month-old son had been in the cab with him when the brakes failed on a steep grade outside Chattanooga. Both Marcus and the baby had been killed instantly when their truck jackknifed and rolled down a mountainside. The company had recovered the truck, repaired the damage, and put it back into service without telling me about its tragic history. I sat in that truck stop parking lot until dawn, listening to the intermittent crying and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to march into the company office and demand a different truck, but how could I explain that I was being haunted by the ghost of a dead baby? They'd think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. Instead, I decided to finish the run to Jacksonville and see if the phenomenon continued. If it did, I'd find a way to deal with it. If it stopped, I'd chalk it up to stress and move on with my life. But as I drove through the Georgia countryside that morning, something new happened. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that it seemed unnatural. Then, just as I was beginning to feel relieved, I heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of an adult, but the soft padding of someone small walking around in the cargo area behind me. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was moving around in my trailer, despite the fact that I'd locked it securely, and there was no way for anyone to get inside while I was driving. I pulled over immediately and opened the trailer doors, my heart pounding as I searched the cargo space with my flashlight. Once again, I found nothing. The furniture was exactly where it should be, undisturbed and properly secured. But when I climbed back into my cab, there was something on the passenger seat that hadn't been there before. A small stuffed elephant, the kind of toy you might give to a baby or toddler. It was old and well-worn, with one of its ears partially torn off, and its gray fabric faded from years of handling. I picked up the toy with trembling hands, and immediately the cab filled with the scent of baby powder, and that sweet, innocent smell that all young children carry with them. The crying started again, but this time it was different, softer, more content, like a child who'd been reunited with a beloved toy. I sat there on the side of a Georgia highway, holding a stuffed elephant that had belonged to a dead baby, listening to the ghostly echoes of a tragedy that had occurred 2 years before I'd ever set foot in that truck. For the first time since my divorce, I found myself crying, not just for Marcus Webb and his infant son, but for all the children in the world who don't get the chance to grow up. All the families torn apart by random accidents and cruel fate. The rest of the drive to Jacksonville passed in relative peace. The crying continued occasionally, but it was gentler now, less distressed. It was as if the child's spirit had been waiting for someone to acknowledge his presence, to recognize that he'd existed and been loved. When I reached the delivery point, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of reporting the stuffed elephant as lost property or throwing it away, I kept it. I placed it carefully on my dashboard where I could see it while driving, and from that moment on, I never traveled alone. The crying continued on subsequent runs, but it changed character over time. Sometimes it was playful, like a happy baby babbling to himself. Sometimes it was sleepy, the kind of soft murmuring that children make when they're drifting off to nap. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, I would hear something that sounded almost like laughter. I never saw the child, never had any visual confirmation that Marcus Webb's son was riding with me. But I felt his presence constantly, a gentle reminder that love doesn't end with death, and that some bonds are too strong to be broken by something as trivial as the separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. My fellow drivers thought I was eccentric for keeping a stuffed elephant on my dashboard, but I didn't care. That little toy had become a talisman, a symbol of my commitment to honoring the memory of a child I'd never met, but somehow felt responsible for protecting. 6 months later, something remarkable happened. I was driving through Tennessee, not far from the site of the original accident, when the crying stopped mid-sob. The cab fell silent, and I felt a sudden sense of peace wash over me like warm sunlight. When I looked at the dashboard, the stuffed elephant was gone. I pulled over and searched the entire truck, but I never found it. The toy had simply vanished, taking with it the presence I'd grown accustomed to having as my traveling companion. I like to think that Marcus Webb's son finally found his way to wherever he was supposed to be, that my acknowledgement of his existence and my care for his memory had somehow helped him move on to whatever comes after this life. Or maybe he just got tired of riding with a lonely trucker and decided to find more interesting companions. Either way, the truck has been quiet ever since. No more crying, no more footsteps, no more mysterious toys appearing on my passenger seat. Just the normal sounds of diesel engine and highway wind, the same soundtrack that accompanies every professional driver on America's endless roads. But I still think about that little boy sometimes, especially when I pass the spot where he and his father died. I say a prayer for both of them, hoping they're together somewhere safe and happy, free from the dangers and disappointments of this world. And I've learned something valuable from that supernatural experience, that the living have a responsibility to remember the dead, especially the innocent ones who never got a chance to make their mark on the world. Sometimes all it takes is acknowledgement, a simple recognition that someone existed and mattered, to bring peace to a restless spirit. The highways of America are haunted by thousands of stories like Marcus and his son's tragedies that happen so quickly and quietly that the rest of the world barely notices. But the drivers who travel those roads every day carry those stories with them, adding to the collective memory of all the lives that have been lost in service of keeping this country's goods moving from place to place. We're the witnesses, the keepers of memories that would otherwise be forgotten. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to provide comfort to the spirits who still wander those highways, looking for someone to remember that they were once here, once loved, and once mattered to the people who miss them still. I need to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made, a decision born of desperation that cost me everything I held dear, and taught me that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how desperate your circumstances become. My name is Marcus, though I prefer to keep my last name to myself for reasons that will become clear as this story unfolds. This happened in the spring of 2014, when I was 26 years old and thought I knew everything about life, love, and what it meant to be a man. I was living with my girlfriend Sarah in a cramped apartment on the south side of Dallas, working whatever jobs I could find to pay rent and put food on the table. I dropped out of college in my junior year when my father died and left my family with nothing but debt. And I'd been struggling to make ends meet ever since. Sarah was pregnant with our first child, a development that should have filled me with joy, but instead sent me into a panic about our financial situation. I was working at a fast food restaurant for minimum wage, barely earning enough to cover our current expenses, let alone the additional costs that would come with a baby. We needed cribs, car seats, diapers, medical bills. The list seemed endless, and the numbers never added up to anything but more debt. I'd applied for dozens of better jobs, but nobody wanted to hire a college dropout with no real skills and a spotty work history. The economy was still recovering from the recession, and there were 10 qualified candidates for every decent position. I was trapped in a cycle of poverty that seemed impossible to break, watching Sarah's belly grow larger while our bank account grew smaller. That's when my grandmother's stories started coming back to me. Abuela Rosa had raised me after my mother died when I was 8 years old. She was a woman of deep faith, but also someone who believed in older, darker traditions that predated Christianity in our family's history. She'd grown up in rural Mexico, where the line between the spiritual and physical worlds was thin, and she'd learned things about the supernatural that she rarely discussed in polite company. But sometimes, late at night when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her telling stories to her friends about people who'd made deals with entities from the other side. People who'd traded their souls for wealth, power, or love, only to discover that such bargains always came with terrible costs. As a child, I dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of superstitious nonsense that uneducated people believed in the absence of scientific understanding. But as my financial desperation grew deeper, I found myself remembering the details of those old tales, wondering if there might be truth hidden beneath the layers of myth and tradition. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late April. Sarah was 6 months pregnant, and we just received an eviction notice giving us 30 days to come up with 3 months back rent or lose our apartment. I'd been laid off from the restaurant earlier that week due to budget cuts, and our savings account contained exactly $47.32. Sarah was asleep, exhausted from her pregnancy and the stress of our situation, when I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I remembered the ritual that Abuela Rosa had described in one of her stories, the specific words and actions that could supposedly summon something from the darkness beyond our world. I won't describe the process in detail. I have no desire to enable others to make the same mistake I did. But I will say that it involved candles, symbols drawn in salt, and invocations spoken in a mixture of Spanish and Latin that my grandmother had taught me years earlier. At first, nothing happened. I knelt on the floor of our living room for what felt like hours, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure. But just as I was about to give up and go to bed, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and I knew I was no longer alone. The entity that appeared to me wasn't the red-skinned, horned demon of popular imagination. Instead, it looked like an ordinary middle-aged man in an expensive business suit, with perfectly groomed hair and eyes that reflected no light whatsoever. He spoke in a voice that was pleasant and cultured, like a college professor or successful businessman. "You called," he said simply, "and I have answered. What do you want?" I told him about our situation, the pregnancy, the eviction notice, the desperate need for money and stable employment. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally like he was reviewing a loan application. "These things can be arranged," he said when I finished. "I can provide you with employment that pays well, enough money to support your growing family, and the kind of financial security that will allow you to sleep peacefully at night." "What do you want in return?" I asked, because even in my desperation, I understood that nothing comes free. He smiled, and for a moment, his perfectly human facade slipped enough to reveal something ancient and predatory underneath. "Eventually, I'll collect what is owed to me, but not today, not tomorrow. You'll have years to enjoy the benefits of our arrangement before payment comes due." I should have asked more questions, should have demanded specifics about what kind of payment he expected. But I was young and desperate and terrified of losing everything, so I agreed to his terms without fully understanding what I was signing up for. The next morning, I received a phone call from a trucking company that was looking for new drivers. They offered to pay for my CDL training, guaranteed employment upon completion, and starting wages that were 3 times what I'd been making at the restaurant. Within 6 weeks, I was behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, hauling freight across the American Southwest, and earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible. Sarah was thrilled by our sudden change in fortune. We moved to a better apartment, bought baby furniture, and started planning for a future that seemed bright and secure. She never asked too many questions about how I'd landed such a good job so quickly. She was just grateful that we were finally getting ahead instead of falling further behind. Our son Matthew was born in late August, a perfect, healthy baby who immediately became the center of our universe. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was succeeding at something important. I was providing for my family, building a stable life, and watching my son grow stronger and more curious every day. But the entity that had granted me this prosperity wasn't content to wait indefinitely for his payment. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 months after Matthew's birth. My uncle Carlos, who had been like a second father to me after my own dad died, was found dead in his apartment under circumstances that the police couldn't explain. He was only 43 years old and had been in perfect health, but he'd apparently died of what the coroner called sudden cardiac arrest, despite having no history of heart problems. At the funeral, I felt watched, not by the other mourners, but by something invisible that seemed to be studying my grief, measuring my reaction to this first taste of loss. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew that Carlos's death wasn't random. The supernatural entity began visiting me during my long-haul runs, appearing in my passenger seat when I was alone on dark highways. He never threatened me directly, but his presence was a constant reminder that our bargain was still in effect, and that he would eventually come to collect what he was owed. Your uncle was getting too close to the truth about our arrangement, he explained during one of these visits. He was asking questions, making inquiries about the sudden improvement in your circumstances. It was necessary to silence him before he could interfere with our business relationship. I wanted to break the deal, to tell him that I didn't want his help anymore and would find some other way to support my family. But he reminded me that contracts signed in blood, metaphorically speaking, weren't easily dissolved, and that attempting to renege on our agreement would have consequences for everyone I loved. The second payment came 6 months later, when Matthew developed what doctors initially diagnosed as a severe case of pneumonia. But as his condition worsened, it became clear that he was suffering from something far more serious, a rare form of leukemia that typically struck older children, not infants who hadn't yet reached their first birthday. The irony was crushing. I'd made my deal to provide for my son's future, but the entity's price for granting my wish was my son's health and possibly his life. The money I was earning as a trucker would now go toward medical bills, hospital stays, and experimental treatments that might or might not save Matthew's life. Sarah blamed herself, convinced that something she'd done during pregnancy had caused our son's illness. She had no idea that the real cause was sitting in the driver's seat of a truck somewhere in West Texas, counting the cost of his desperation in the tears of the woman he loved and the suffering of an innocent child. I tried to explain everything to Sarah, the ritual, the entity, the true nature of my sudden good fortune. But she thought I was having some kind of nervous breakdown brought on by stress and grief. She insisted that I see a therapist, that I get medication for what she assumed was a psychological disorder. Our relationship began to deteriorate under the weight of Matthew's illness and my inability to explain what was really happening to our family. Sarah moved back to her parents' house in Oklahoma, taking our son with her for what she said would be temporary medical treatment at a children's hospital in Oklahoma City. That was 3 years ago. I haven't seen Matthew since then, though Sarah sends me occasional updates about his condition and treatment. The leukemia is in remission for now, but the doctors can't promise that it won't return. And I know that as long as my bargain with the entity remains in effect, my son will never be truly safe. I still drive trucks, still earn good money, still have all the material benefits that the entity promised me. But none of it matters, because I've lost the only things that were truly important: my family, my son's health, and my peace of mind. The entity still visits me sometimes, usually when I'm at my lowest points. He seems to take pleasure in reminding me that I got exactly what I asked for: financial security and stable employment, but that I never specified that I wanted my family to remain safe and healthy. That's the problem with you humans, he told me during our most recent encounter. You focus so narrowly on your immediate problems that you never consider the broader implications of the solutions you're seeking. You wanted money and a job, and I provided both. The fact that achieving those goals required sacrificing other things is simply the nature of the transaction. I've learned that evil entities, whether you call them demons, devils, or something else entirely, are masters of the technicality, the loophole, the unintended consequence. They'll give you exactly what you ask for while finding ways to make sure that getting it destroys everything else you care about. The worst part is knowing that I did this to myself and my family. Nobody forced me to perform that ritual or agree to the entity's terms. I was driven by fear and desperation, but ultimately, I made a conscious choice to trade my soul for temporary prosperity. And now, I have to live with the consequences of that decision. Sometimes I think about trying to break the bargain, to find some way to free myself and my family from the entity's influence. But I've done enough research to know that such contracts rarely have escape clauses, and that attempting to void them often results in even worse consequences for everyone involved. So I keep driving, keep earning money that I'll probably never be able to spend on the people I love, and keep hoping that somehow, someday, I'll find a way to undo the damage I've caused. But hope is a luxury that men like me don't deserve, and redemption is a gift that has to be earned through suffering that I've only just begun to experience. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: there are no shortcuts to prosperity, no easy solutions to life's problems, and no bargains that don't come with hidden costs. The universe maintains its own balance, and anything you gain through supernatural means will ultimately be paid for with interest by the people you love most. The devil's bargains are seductive because they promise immediate relief from whatever crisis is driving you to desperation. But they're designed to trap you in cycles of loss and regret that are far worse than the original problem you were trying to solve. Some prices are simply too high to pay, no matter how desperate you become. I learned that lesson too late to save my family, but maybe sharing my story will help others avoid making the same catastrophic mistake. The road ahead of me stretches into darkness, literally and figuratively. I'll keep driving it until the entity decides to collect the final payment on our bargain. And when that day comes, I hope that my suffering will finally be enough to free my son from the curse I brought upon our family through my own foolish desperation. My name is Ricardo, and the story I'm about to tell you is different from the others you might have heard about supernatural encounters on America's highways. This isn't about ghosts, demons, or unexplained phenomena. This is about something far more terrifying: the evil that human beings are capable of when they believe they can act without consequences, when they think the darkness and isolation of the highway gives them permission to indulge their worst impulses. This happened in the summer of 2019, when I was 43 years old and had been driving long-haul trucks for nearly 18 years. I was living in Phoenix with my wife Carmen and our teenage son Miguel, who was 15 and already talking about following in my footsteps as a professional driver. Carmen worked as a school administrator, and together we'd built a comfortable middle-class life that revolved around family, work, and the small pleasures that make existence worthwhile. For months leading up to that terrible night, there had been reports of truckers being found dead along a particular stretch of Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. The deaths were being attributed to accidents. Drivers who'd apparently lost control of their vehicles and crashed in remote areas where it took hours or sometimes days for help to arrive. But the details never quite added up. The victims were all experienced drivers who knew those roads well, and their trucks often showed signs of damage that seemed inconsistent with simple loss of control accidents. Bodies were found in locations far from their vehicles, sometimes with injuries that suggested they'd been attacked rather than hurt in crashes. The law enforcement agencies involved, Arizona Highway Patrol, New Mexico State Police, and various county sheriff's departments, seemed either unable or unwilling to connect the dots. Each death was investigated as an isolated incident, and if there was a coordinated effort to identify a pattern, those of us who drove those routes regularly never heard about it. Most of my fellow drivers at the company had started avoiding that stretch of highway, taking longer routes through California or Colorado to avoid what we'd begun calling the death zone. But avoiding it meant burning more fuel, losing time, and ultimately making less money on runs between the Southwest and the East Coast. As one of the more senior drivers with an excellent safety record, I was often assigned the most direct routes regardless of the potential risks involved. The company figured that experienced drivers like me could handle whatever challenges the road might present, and they weren't willing to absorb the additional costs of having their freight take circuitous routes to avoid unsubstantiated dangers. So when I was assigned a load of construction equipment bound for a job site outside Amarillo, I knew I'd be taking Interstate 40 through the heart of the danger zone. It was a night-run pickup in Phoenix at 6 p.m., delivery in Texas by noon the next day, which meant I'd be driving through the most remote sections of highway during the darkest hours. Carmen wasn't happy about it. She'd been following the news reports about the mysterious trucker deaths, and she had a bad feeling about this particular run. "Why can't you take the route through Denver?" she asked as I was getting ready to leave. "It's only a few hours longer." "Because the company's paying me to take the most efficient route," I told her. "And because I've been driving trucks for 18 years without getting myself killed. I'm not going to start being scared of shadows now." But as I drove west toward Flagstaff that evening, I found myself thinking about the drivers who died on this stretch of road. Men like me, with families who loved them and depended on them, who'd set out on routine runs and never made it home. What had they encountered in the darkness? What had turned their familiar highways into death traps? The sun set as I climbed into the high country around Flagstaff, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, I felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with the very real evil that some human beings are capable of. It was just past midnight when I saw the stranded vehicle. A sedan was pulled over on the shoulder about 20 miles east of Holbrook, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. Even from a distance, I could see that it was tilted at an odd angle, like it had blown a tire or suffered some other mechanical failure. As I got closer, I could make out a figure standing beside the car, someone who appeared to be waving for help. Every instinct I'd developed during 18 years on the road was telling me to keep driving, to call 911, and let the authorities handle whatever situation was unfolding on that dark stretch of highway. But I'd been raised to help people in trouble, and the idea of leaving someone stranded in the desert without assistance went against everything my father had taught me about being a decent human being. I pulled over about 50 yards behind the disabled vehicle and grabbed my flashlight before climbing down from my cab. The figure beside the car, a middle-aged man in work clothes, walked toward me with what appeared to be relief and gratitude. "Thank God you stopped," he said as he approached. "I've been out here for over an hour. My car hit something in the road and damaged the front end. I think I bent the steering mechanism." He seemed normal enough, just another traveler who'd had a run of bad luck on a lonely highway. But something about the situation felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. Maybe it was the fact that his car's damage didn't look like the result of hitting road debris. The front end was crumpled in a way that suggested a deliberate collision, rather than an accident. "Let me take a look," I said, playing for time while I tried to figure out what was making me so nervous. That's when I heard it, a woman's voice calling for help from inside the car. Not loud, but persistent and obviously distressed. The man saw my reaction, and his demeanor changed instantly, dropping the grateful victim act and revealing something predatory underneath. "She's hurt," he said with a smile that made my blood run cold. "Car accident. I was just trying to help her when you showed up." But I could see through the car's windows now, and what I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. There was a woman in the back seat, and she was definitely not there voluntarily. Her hands appeared to be bound, and she was struggling against restraints while trying to call for help through what looked like tape over her mouth. This wasn't a stranded motorist. This was a predator who used a fake breakdown to lure good Samaritans into stopping. Then did God knows what to them in the isolation of the desert. The woman in his car was either his latest victim or bait, to ensure that potential rescuers would get close enough for him to attack. I should have run back to my truck immediately and called for help. Instead, I made a decision that probably saved that woman's life, but put my own at serious risk. I grabbed a tire iron from my truck's tool compartment and approached the man with as much confidence as I could muster. "Let her go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now." He laughed and pulled a knife from his jacket, a wicked-looking blade that had obviously seen use before. "You should have minded your own business," he said. "Now you're going to join her in the back seat, and we're going to have some fun before I dump your bodies in the desert." What happened next was a blur of violence and desperation. The man lunged at me with the knife, but I managed to deflect his attack with the tire iron and catch him in the ribs with a backhand swing that sent him staggering. He was quick and vicious, but I had the advantages of size, reach, and righteous anger on my side. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. When it was over, the man was unconscious on the asphalt, and I was standing over him with my tire iron, breathing hard and shaking from adrenaline. The woman in the car was still calling for help, so I broke the rear window and helped her out of her restraints. Her name was Jennifer, and she was a nurse from Flagstaff who'd been driving home from visiting her sister in Phoenix when the man had rammed her car from behind and forced her off the road. He'd been holding her captive for over 3 hours, telling her in graphic detail what he planned to do to her before killing her and disposing of her body. We called 911 and waited for the authorities to arrive, keeping the unconscious man tied up with rope from my truck in case he regained consciousness. When the Arizona Highway Patrol officers arrived, they were amazed to discover that we'd captured someone they'd been hunting for months. The man's name was Carl Brennan, and he was a serial killer who'd been targeting truckers and other travelers along that stretch of Interstate 40 for over 2 years. His method was simple but effective. Use a disabled vehicle to lure victims into stopping, then attack them when they tried to help. He'd been responsible for at least 8 deaths that the authorities knew about, and probably several more that hadn't been connected to him. The officers explained that Brennan had been living in an abandoned ranch house about 10 miles from the highway, using it as a base of operations for his killing spree. They'd found evidence linking him to several of the trucker deaths, including personal effects stolen from his victims and disturbing souvenirs that he'd kept as trophies. Jennifer and I were both treated as heroes by the media and law enforcement, but I didn't feel heroic. I felt sick and angry that such evil could exist in the world, that someone could derive pleasure from causing terror and death to innocent people just trying to make a living or get home to their families. The experience changed my perspective on the dangers that professional drivers face every day. We worry about mechanical failures, bad weather, and drunk drivers, but we don't often think about the human predators who see our isolation and vulnerability as opportunities for violence. Carl Brennan was eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though he'll probably spend decades on death row before his sentence is carried out. Jennifer recovered from her physical injuries, though she still suffers from PTSD related to her ordeal. We stay in touch occasionally, bound together by our shared experience of surviving an encounter with pure evil. As for me, I still drive trucks, but I'm more cautious now about stopping to help stranded motorists, especially in remote areas during nighttime hours. It's a sad commentary on the state of our world that good intentions can be exploited by people like Brennan. But that's the reality we live in. I've also become an advocate for better communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies when it comes to investigating suspicious deaths on our highways. Too many predators like Brennan are able to operate for years because their crimes cross multiple jurisdictions, and the various agencies involved don't share information effectively. The highways of America are supposed to be arteries of commerce and connection, routes that bind our vast country together and enable the movement of goods and people across enormous distances. But they're also hunting grounds for human monsters who understand that isolation and darkness can provide cover for unspeakable acts of violence. Most of the people you'll encounter on the road are decent, honest folks just trying to get where they're going safely. But there are exceptions, predators who wear human faces and speak in reasonable tones while planning acts of horrific cruelty. The trick is learning to recognize the difference before it's too late. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about a situation, it probably is. Your gut reactions are based on thousands of years of evolutionary programming designed to keep you alive, and they're often more reliable than your rational mind when it comes to detecting danger. Don't let paranoia rule your life, but don't ignore the warning signs either. The real monsters don't always announce themselves with dramatic music and obvious threats. Sometimes they appear as ordinary people in need of help, counting on your natural compassion to make you vulnerable to attack. Carl Brennan looked like any other middle-aged American man, the kind of person you might work with, live next to, or pass on the street without a second thought. But underneath that unremarkable exterior was a creature of pure malevolence who took pleasure in causing suffering and death. The most terrifying thing about my encounter with him wasn't the physical danger, though that was real enough. It was the realization that such evil can hide behind perfectly normal appearances, that monsters walk among us wearing human faces and speaking in voices that sound just like our own. Jennifer and I were lucky that night. We survived an encounter with a predator who'd killed at least 8 other people in similar circumstances. But our survival came down to a combination of good instincts, quick thinking, and plain old luck factors that might not align so favorably for the next potential victims. The best we can do is stay alert, trust our instincts, and remember that the greatest horrors we face aren't supernatural at all. They're the monsters that choose to be monsters, the human beings who have decided that other people's lives are worth less than their own twisted pleasures. Those are the creatures that truly deserve our fear, because unlike ghosts and demons, they're absolutely, undeniably real. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.